Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, Frozen Echoes of the Storm. The blizzard had begun as a gentle snowfall, the type that invited memories of hot chocolate and cozy evenings by the fire. I had watched the flakes dance outside my window, mesmerized by their delicate descent. But as the day waned, that soft, inviting flurry transformed into a relentless torrent, each flake sharp as ice and heavy with malice, swirling like an angry specter. I still remember how the wind howled, a mournful sound that echoed through the empty halls of our old farmhouse. My parents had taken a trip to see my grandmother, leaving me alone for the weekend. I wasn't worried at first. The house felt familiar, almost comforting, with its creaking floorboards and the smell of aged wood permeating the air. But as the storm grew fiercer, a sense of impending dread clawed at my chest, gnawing away any semblance of security. By nightfall, the snow piled high against the windows, blotting out the world like a thick, suffocating blanket. I flicked on the old oil lamps, their flickering flames casting long shadows that danced along the walls, whispering secrets I felt I should not know. The power had gone out early in the evening, leaving me cut off from the outside world. I wrapped myself in a heavy quilt, the fabric scratchy but comforting as I settled in for what I hoped would be a peaceful night. I tried to distract myself with a book, but my thoughts drifted to the storm. Outside, the wind roared, probing at the edges of the house, seeking entry like a hungry beast. Each gust rattled the windows, and I could feel the vibrations in my bones. I shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the door, half expecting it to swing open and let in the icy shadows. Hours passed, the storm relentless. I could hear the scraping of branches against the roof, the sound a reminder of the chaos beyond my little sanctuary. I finally set the book aside, my heart racing as a strange feeling washed over me. It was a sensation that told me I was not as alone as I had believed. Against my better judgment, I stood up and made my way to the front door. The handle was cold under my palm, sending a shiver down my spine. I pressed my forehead against the wooden door, straining to hear the world outside, but all I could catch was the symphony of the storm. Just as I turned away, a loud thud echoed from the back of the house. My heart leaped, and I froze, caught between curiosity and terror. I considered the possibilities. Perhaps it was just the wind, or a branch that had fallen from a nearby tree. But as the sound repeated, a heavy thump followed by an eerie silence, the rational explanations lost their grip on my mind. I felt drawn to the sound, an inexplicable force pulling me toward the back door. Each step was a struggle against my instincts, which screamed at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the weight of it oddly comforting as I flicked it on, casting a narrow beam into the darkness. The hallway leading to the back of the house was a tunnel of shadows, the lamplight barely illuminating the edges. I moved slowly, listening intently for any further sounds. Each creak of the floorboards felt like a whispered warning, urging me to retreat, but I pressed on, driven by an unshakable sense that something waited for me at the back door. The back room was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, remnants of my childhood I had long since forgotten. The door, a battered thing with paint peeling like sunburnt skin, stood ajar, the wind howling through the crack, as if mocking my hesitation. I pushed it open, the door groaning on its hinges, revealing a sight that made my blood run cold. The snow had drifted against the door, forming a white wall that almost reached my waist. But there was something else, a footprint. It was strange and distorted, the sole too large and the outline too irregular to belong to anyone I knew. I knelt down, flashlight trembling in my grip, illuminating the dark expanse of snow. I traced the shape with my finger, feeling the cold bite through my skin. In the distance, beyond the storm, I could have sworn I heard a voice, low and rasping, carried on the wind. My heart raced as I pulled myself back, urgency flooding my veins. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The storm outside intensified, a roaring beast that shook the foundations of the house. I stumbled back to the living room, feeling the weight of unseen eyes boring into my back. The shadows danced longer and darker as the lamp flickered. I needed to find my phone, to call for help, but it was charging in my room, and I had no desire to return there. Every creak of the house felt like footsteps, every gust a whisper, and I lost myself in my own thoughts, conjuring nightmares of what lurked just outside my door. I sat on the worn-out couch, clenching the flashlight like a lifeline, wrestling with the oppressive silence that filled the gaps between the howling winds. Hours stretched on, but I dared not leave my sanctuary. The snowstorm raged outside like an out-of-control nightmare, and I began to wonder if any rescue would come. If anyone even knew I was here. Just as I lost myself in these thoughts, a loud bang echoed through the house, vibrating the walls, a sound so close I could feel it in my bones. Then, silence. The snowstorm came in the dead of night, a howling beast that devoured the landscape and clawed at the walls of my house. I had seen the weather reports, of course, though never had I envisioned the ferocity that would bear down on me. Outside, the world dissolved into a swirling mass of white, the once familiar surroundings transformed into a featureless wasteland. It was beautiful, in a twisted way, but there was an underlying sense of dread that gnawed at me. As I settled down in my small living room, the flickering candlelight cast jagged shadows on the walls. I lit them after the power had flickered and died, leaving me in a suffocating silence, broken only by the relentless wind. I wrapped myself in an old quilt, its fabric fraying at the edges, and listened to the storm lash against my windows. Each gust sounded like a low growl, as if the very storm were alive, seeking entrance into my sanctuary. The snow piled high outside, and with each passing hour, it seemed to encase my home in a tomb-like stillness. I could barely make out the outlines of the trees flanking my driveway, their branches sagging under the weight of the snow. My phone, once a lifeline, had gone silent, no signal, no means of reaching anyone. I was cut off, stranded in my own home, and the isolation pressed down on me like a heavy weight. Around 2 a.m., a noise broke the quiet, a soft thud against the door. I froze, clutching the quilt tighter around my shoulders. It was nothing, I told myself, just the wind, playing tricks. But then it came again, a dull thump that reverberated through the air, mingling with the howl of the storm. I slipped off the couch, my heart racing, and crept toward the door. My breath fogged the glass as I peered through the peephole. The storm obscured my view, but I could just make out a figure, a dark silhouette swaying against the light. Panic surged through me. Who would be out there in this weather? What could possibly compel someone to brave the storm? Hello? I called, my voice trembling. Is someone there? The figure stilled, and for a moment, I thought I saw the slightest movement toward the door. Was it a trick of the light, or did they actually shift closer? The dread coiled tighter in my gut. I had no weapon, no way of defending myself against whatever lay beyond the wood that separated us. I weighed my options: stay quiet, stay safe, or open the door and see what was happening. Just as I was about to back away, another thud shook the frame, this one stronger, as if they were trying to break in. I backed away, the quilt slipping from my shoulders as my instinct screamed at me to flee. Then, as if sensing my fear, the figure spoke. "Please, I need help." The voice was muffled but urgent, almost desperate. A chill ran down my spine, and I hesitated. Should I trust this phantom in the storm? What if they meant me harm? Yet my conscience clawed at me. What if they were truly in need? I knew the snow could bury a person alive. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm lost," My car got stuck. I just need to come in and call for help. Please. The pleading tone tugged at my heart. I was torn, caught between instinct and empathy. Finally, I made a decision. I unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door a crack. The wind rushed in, a freezing gust that sent a shiver through my bones. I peered out into the storm, and that was when I saw her. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with wild hair sticking out from under a tattered hat and snowflakes clinging to her cheeks. She looked exhausted, her clothes soaked and clinging oddly to her form. My heart ached at the sight, and without thinking, I opened the door wider. Come in, come in. I urged, stepping aside to let her through. As she stumbled into the warmth, I caught a whiff of something odd, a metallic scent that mixed with the dampness of her clothes. I brushed it aside, focusing instead on her shivering frame as she closed the door behind her, cutting off the howling wind. Thank you, she said, her voice shaky. I didn't think I'd find anyone out here. No one should be out in this, I said, pushing a strand of hair behind my ear. What were you doing? I was on my way home from a party, she explained, her breath coming out in foggy puffs. I thought I could make it, but the storm hit faster than I expected. Well, you're safe now. Let me get you a towel, I offered, turning towards the bathroom. That's when I heard the sound again, a soft thud, this time against the back door. I paused, the towel slipping from my grip. My heart raced as I exchanged nervous glances with the stranger, her eyes wide and reflecting panic. What was that? She whispered, voice trembling. I don't know, I replied, fear creeping into my tone. Stay here. I took tentative steps toward the back of the house, dread coursing through me. The wind screamed outside, and the thud came again, louder, more insistent. I reached for the doorknob, hesitating as I heard a low growl ripple through the air, drowning out the storm. Stay back, I warned, turning to look at her. But she was already moving, drawn toward the door as if something out there called to her. Wait! I shouted, breaking through the growing urgency. But it was too late. She had turned the knob, and as the door swung open, the icy wind rushed in. For a brief second, I could see the dark shapes moving just beyond the threshold, shadowy figures, their forms indistinct but unmistakably there. Panic surged through me as I lunged for her arm, the storm howling like a banshee around us. Something was out there, and in that moment, I understood with terrifying clarity that the real horror lay not in the storm itself, but in what it had brought with it. The howling wind had settled into a relentless whisper, swirling the snow into ghostly patterns that seemed to dance against the window panes. I had hoped the blizzard would relent, that it would spare me the misery of isolation, but as the hours dragged on, the storm only grew more fierce. My small cabin, nestled deep in the woods, felt more like a prison than a refuge. I watched as the landscape outside transformed into an endless expanse of white, the trees bending under the weight of the snow, their skeletal limbs clawing at the dark sky. Each gust rattled the walls, and I pulled my blanket tighter around my shoulders, stifling a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The unease I had felt since arriving weighed heavy in the pit of my stomach, gnawing at me like a predatory animal. It started with the odd noise. At first, it was just a creaking, unnatural sound that any cabin would make in a storm. But then there were the whispers, low and indistinct, drifting through the silence like a song half remembered. I convinced myself it was merely the wind, the trees communicating in a language lost to me. Yet, the longer I listened, the more I could swear I heard words, pleading and desperate, slipping through the blizzard's breath. I shook my head, clearing the cobwebs of paranoia. I had come to this secluded place to escape, to clear my mind. The memories of the city, the constant noise of life, and the crushing pressure of expectations had driven me to seek solace in solitude. Alone, my thoughts echoed louder than the wind outside, each one a reminder of the reasons I had fled. I tried to occupy myself, flipping through the pages of a tattered novel I had brought, but the words blurred together. The shadows seemed to stretch across the room, and I found myself glancing at the dark corners, half expecting someone or something to emerge. I tossed the book aside and reached for my phone. No signal, of course. I had anticipated that, but a part of me still held onto a sliver of hope that I would connect with the outside world, if only for a moment. The storm intensified, a furious cacophony that drowned out my thoughts. I could hear the snow piling against the door, a heavy blanket that threatened to seal me inside completely. Fear twisted in my chest. I was utterly alone, with no immediate hope of rescue. The power flickered and dove into darkness, surrounding me in a stifling black void. The only light came from the emergency lantern I'd kept for such occasions. I set it down on the table, its warm glow casting an eerie flicker across the walls. It was then I heard it again, a soft, distinct whisper, this time unmistakably close. My pulse quickened as I strained to listen, my heart hammering in my ears. "Help me," the voice pleaded, almost drowned by the wind outside. I froze, instinctively believing this was some twisted trick of my mind. But as I stood there in silence, the words returned, clear and chilling. "Help me, please." A cold sweat broke out across my brow. It felt as if the very air around me had thickened, suffocating in its intensity. I wanted to call out, to demand whoever it was to show themselves, but dread paralyzed me. Instead, I took cautious steps toward the front door. The storm's fury clawed at the wood, and I hesitated, staring into the white abyss outside. Was it worth the risk? A part of me screamed to turn back, to hide beneath the blankets and pretend the world had vanished. But another part, one that craved connection amidst the isolation, urged me forward. I reached for the door handle, the cold metal biting into my palm. With a deep breath, I flung open the door, snow rushing in, a blinding wave of white enveloping me. I squinted against the onslaught, searching frantically for the source of the voice. It was impossible to gauge how far the storm had buried the ground. "Hello?" I shouted, my voice lost in the tempest. "Is anyone out there?" Nothing answered but the harsh wind that whipped through the cabin, mocking my desperation. I stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath my feet, and squinted into the swirling storm. It was as if the world had been reduced to nothing but shades of white and gray. I took another step, and then another, calling out again. My breath came in clouds, and panic began to seep into my veins. What had I done? I was a fool, a stupid fool. I was unprepared for this ferocity. The whispers returned, this time almost like laughter, echoing off the trees. Each sound felt like a hand gripping my shoulder, pulling me deeper into the storm. "Help me." I stumbled back, fear surging as I turned to run. My heart raced, pounding against my chest as I fought to navigate through the blinding snow. But the more I moved, the more the landscape seemed to shift. I was lost, disoriented, the cabin disappearing into the white haze behind me. Just as I thought I would be swallowed whole by the storm, I caught a glimpse of shadows flitting between the trees, dark figures darting just beyond my line of sight. The whispers grew louder, turning frantic, pulling at something deep within me. I had to find the source. As I drew nearer, I stumbled into a clearing, the trees thinning. But the figures were gone, and the whispers faded into an unsettling silence. The tranquility of the clearing felt wrong, oppressive, as if the storm itself held its breath. Out in the vastness, I realized I was utterly alone. I turned, ready to sprint back, but as the snow continued to rise around me, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My escape was now more difficult than ever. The storm had buried me alive. I needed to get back to the cabin, to the safety of the light. But even as I tried to retrace my steps, the snow howled in defiance, and the shadows began to dance again, taunting me, whispering my name. Wind howled around the cabin, rattling the windows and carrying flakes of snow that stung like tiny needles as they whipped against the glass. I huddled by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting distorted shadows across the room, giving life to the inanimate objects that lined the walls. Each gust of frigid air made the old timbers groan as if they, too, were unsettled by the storm. The day had started gray, but the weather had turned hostile with a suddenness that felt unnatural, almost supernatural. It was as if the sky had conspired against us, burying us beneath a blanket of white just when we thought we could see the sun again. I recalled the way the radio crackled to life earlier, the stern voice of the weatherman warning of a coming snowstorm. "Take precautions," he had said. "Stay indoors if you can. Conditions will worsen rapidly." I had thought we were well prepared, but I hadn't anticipated how isolating it would feel, surrounded by the relentless snow that piled higher and higher, enveloping our little sanctuary in a cocoon of white. All I could think of was how I had wished for solitude, for space to breathe without the city's noise. Now, here I was, trapped by the very silence I had yearned for. I glanced at my brother, Mark, who sat at the small dining table, fiddling with his phone. I noticed the growing tension etched across his brow, his lips pressed into a thin line. Earlier, he had tried to keep the mood light, cracking jokes as we prepared for the storm. But the anxiety that had crept into his demeanor was palpable, a reflection of the storm brewing not just outside, but within him. "No signal," he finally muttered, tossing the device down in frustration. "Maybe we should conserve battery," I suggested, although I dreaded the thought of plunging into complete silence. When we had first arrived at the cabin, it had felt like a retreat. Now, it was a prison. The wind screamed, drowning out thoughts, and I felt the walls closing in. Mark stood and moved to the window, peering out through the frost that had accumulated like a delicate lace curtain. "It's getting bad," he said, his voice strained. "I can't see anything past the porch." "I guess we're not going anywhere tonight," I replied, forcing a laugh that didn't reach my eyes. The truth was, the storm was starting to feel alive, as if it had a will of its own, closing in around us. Each time the wind gusted, it seemed to carry whispers, ominous and taunting. Hours passed, and as the night deepened, the atmosphere thickened with a sense of dread. The cozy hearth no longer seemed to ward off the chill. Instead, it became a meager refuge against the encroaching darkness. I had never been afraid of storms before, but something about this one felt different, malevolent, almost. Mark broke the silence after a particularly loud crack of thunder that sent both of us jumping. "Do you think we'll be okay?" he asked, his bravado waning. The mask of confidence he had worn since our arrival had slipped, revealing the worry that lurked beneath. "Of course," I reassured him, though I didn't believe it myself. "We have food, water, and heat. We just need to ride it out." But deep inside, I felt a gnawing fear, the kind that burrows into your mind and festers. The wind screamed louder now, making the owls vibrate. Shadows flickered, elongating and shrinking, creating forms that teased the corners of my eyes. In those fleeting moments, they almost looked like people, figures huddled close, their faces obscured. I shook my head, willing myself to focus, to push away the creeping dread. Then, a sound broke through the storm's fury, a soft thud from outside, followed by the faintest of footsteps crunching on the fresh snow. My heart raced as I exchanged a wide-eyed glance with Mark. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my throat tight. "Yeah, but it's probably just a tree branch or something," he replied, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Right," I said, though my instinct screamed otherwise. As I moved to the window, the wind howled so ferociously that I struggled to pull it open. I finally managed, peering into the abyss of swirling white, the world reduced to shades of gray and black. "Nothing out there," I said, but the unease wouldn't leave me. "Let's just keep an eye on it." Hours turned to a blur as the storm raged on. We tried to distract ourselves with games and stories, but the oppressive atmosphere made concentration impossible. Every creak of the owls felt like a reminder of our isolation, the walls closing in like a vice. Mark finally suggested we check the back door, the only way of escape if the storm turned fatal. Grabbing a heavy flashlight, I followed him, my pulse quickening with each step. The back door creaked ominously as we opened it, the stark cold air rushing in, sharp and biting. What lay beyond was a world transformed. Snow draped everything, a pristine sheet of white that absorbed sound until the only noise was the howling wind. But then I noticed something, the imprint of boot prints leading away from the cabin. They were fresh, the edges sharp, as if someone had walked just moments before. Mark. My voice had dropped to a whisper. Look. He followed my gaze, his expression shifting from confusion to horror. Who would be out here? He stammered. The storm surged, wind screaming like the lost souls of the night, drowning out any rational thought. Panic clawed at my chest, constricting my breath. We should go back inside, I urged, the weight of the unknown pressing down. As we retreated, I could have sworn I heard a soft voice carry on the wind, indistinct yet profoundly unsettling, as if something out there had called my name. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, heart racing, listening. But there was silence now, and the storm, with all its fury, felt like it had turned its attention towards us. The cabin felt smaller, and I could no longer ignore the feeling that we were not alone in the storm. The howling wind tore through the trees, a relentless beast that seemed intent on erasing the world outside. I stood by the window, the glass fogged with my breath, watching as the snow fell in thick, swirling waves. Each flake was a tiny messenger of the storm that had descended upon us, swallowing the familiar landscape and replacing it with a barren whiteness that grew deeper by the hour. It had been 3 days since the storm began, and the world felt like it had folded in on itself, trapping me in a ghostly silence that was more terrifying than any noise. The power had gone out the first night, plunging the house into a dark abyss. I fumbled around with candles, their flickering light casting long shadows that behaved like restless spirits on the walls. My phone was dead, the last indicator of life drained while I was still grasping at the last remnants of normalcy. I tried to signal help, but the storm had swallowed everything. My only companions were the creaking boards beneath my feet and the howling wind outside that sounded eerily like a mournful wail. Isolation turned into paranoia, and I could feel it creeping in like the cold. I wrapped myself in blankets, trying to stave off the chill that seeped into my bones, but it was more than just the temperature that unnerved me. There was something about the storm, an oppressive energy that thickened the air. The house, usually alive with the sounds of creaks and groans, felt like it was holding its breath, keeping secrets in its old walls. I had taken to pacing the dimly lit halls, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. Each time I passed the windows, I found myself peering into the white void outside, half expecting to see a shape moving among the trees. The storm made everything feel alien, transforming the landscape into a vast expanse of untouched snow that could hide anything, anyone. On the second night, I thought I heard something outside, a low thud, the sound of something heavy striking the ground. I froze, holding my breath, listening intently, but the wind swallowed the sound almost as quickly as it came. My mind raced with possibilities. What could be out there? I imagined wolves, or perhaps a creature far worse, drawn from the depths of my imagination, lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the unease clawed at my insides. I could almost feel something watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I forced myself back to bed, the blankets cocooning me in an attempt to stave off the dread, but sleep eluded me. The sound of the wind became a malevolent whisper, and I began to question the nature of my solitude. The third day dragged on, the storm refusing to relent. I rationed what little food I had, forcing myself to eat small portions to stretch it out. I would peek out of the window every hour, hoping for a sign of life, a glimpse of fellow travelers who might have been caught in the storm. But there was nothing. The world was blanketed in silence, and I felt as if I had been abandoned in an endless sea of white. As night fell again, the wind picked up, howling like a banshee outside. I returned to my vigil by the window, the candle flickering ominously. I had just begun to convince myself that perhaps I could brave the storm when a sharp knock echoed through the house. My heart raced, and I nearly dropped the flashlight. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was unmistakable, a solid, deliberate knock, not the whimsy of a tree branch tapping against the window. I pressed my ear against the cold wall, straining to hear any sign of movement outside. My mind rehashed every horror movie I had ever seen, scenarios of madmen or worse hiding in the darkness. Mustering what courage I had left, I approached the door, flashlight held tightly in my hand, as if it were a weapon. Another knock came, firm and insistent. I hesitated, terror gripping me. Who could be out there? They would be a fool to venture out in this weather, or perhaps they were something much worse. I whispered, "Hello?" My voice was barely a murmur, lost in the wind. Silence descended, thick and oppressive. I took a step back, the shadows swallowing the room around me. Just as I turned to retreat, there was a burst of sound, a crash, as if something heavy had fallen against the door. I jumped back, heart in my throat, adrenaline flooding my system. My instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, but where could I possibly go? I stumbled backward into the living room, my eyes darting to the fireplace, where a few embers still glowed. I grabbed a poker, its cold half grounding me. I needed to defend myself. Whatever was out there was not going to get in without a fight. The knocking resumed, more frantic now, and I realized with a sinking heart that it was still coming from the door. It was rhythmic, almost desperate, and with each thud, the shadows in the room deepened. I prepared myself for whatever might come through that door, hoping against hope that I could hold my ground. Then, with a final thunderous blow, the door burst open, the wind slashing through the space, extinguishing the candle and leaving me in darkness. I gripped the poker tighter, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I waited for the storm or something more sinister to enter my home. The night was no longer just cold, it had turned into a living nightmare, and I stood at its threshold, ready to confront whatever horror awaited me. Story 2, Elevator to the Forgotten Floor. The first time I noticed something off about the elevator, I brushed it aside as paranoia. It was a dreary Thursday evening, the kind of day that wraps the world in a shroud of gray and damp. I had just arrived at the Widmore Hotel, a relic from a bygone era that still clung to its faded elegance, despite the persistent mustiness in the air. I was in town for a conference, and after a grueling 5-hour drive, I just wanted to collapse in my room and forget the world for a while. The lobby was grand but eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant clinking of silverware from the dining room and the faint hum of the old chandelier overhead. I approached the reception desk, where an elderly woman with thinning gray hair greeted me with a tired smile. Her name tag read Margaret, and her eyes seemed to carry the weight of countless guests who had passed through the hotel's doors over the years. After I received my room key, a tarnished brass affair that reminded me of my grandmother's heirlooms, I made my way to the elevator, which was situated at the far end of the lobby. The ornate doors were framed by intricate carvings, their once gleaming surfaces dulled by the passage of time. I pressed the button, and a moment later, the doors slid open with a reluctant creak. Inside, I was greeted by the heavy scent of wood polish mixed with something a little more sinister, an underlying smell I couldn't quite place, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The elevator was small, barely accommodating my suitcase and myself. I pressed the button for the 5th floor, and the doors clanked shut, engulfing me in shadows. As the elevator ascended, it jolted unexpectedly, causing me to stumble slightly. I steadied myself, dismissing it as a mere quirk of the aged machinery. But when the elevator came to a halt, it did so with a heavy thud, and a flickering overhead light bathed the space in an unsettling strobe effect. I waited for the doors to open, but they remained stubbornly closed. An uneasy feeling twisted in my stomach. I pressed the button for my floor again, but nothing happened. I leaned against the wall, willing myself to remain calm. After a few disconcerting moments, I reached for my phone, hoping to call for help. To my dismay, I found I had no signal. I pushed the elevator buttons again, more forcefully this time. A faint whirring noise responded, but the doors remained sealed. Minutes felt like hours as I stood there, the air growing thick and claustrophobic. I could hear the distant echoes of laughter from the lobby, reminding me of the life outside this metal cage. I banged my fist against the wall in frustration, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence. A sense of dread crept over me as I considered the possibility of being stuck here for a long time. Just then, I heard a faint noise from above, a soft scuttling sound, like something crawling across metal. My heart raced, and I strained to listen. The noise persisted, accompanied by a low, almost inaudible whisper that sent chills down my spine. My fingers trembled as I pressed my ear against the cold steel of the elevator, trying to discern the source of the unsettling sounds. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding weak in the confined space. "Is anyone there?" The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie stillness that amplified my unease. I pressed the buttons again, this time in rapid succession, desperation gnawing at my mind. The elevator lurched suddenly, and my heart leaped into my throat as the lights flickered once more. Then, for a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the corner of the elevator, a shadow, shifting in the gloom. I turned, expecting to see a trick of the light, but the corner remained empty, as if the darkness itself had swallowed whatever had been there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the elevator jolted again, this time with a violent shake. The doors creaked open, spilling light into the confined space. I rushed forward, eager to escape, but what lay before me was not the hallway I had expected. Instead, I found myself staring into a dimly lit corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly. The walls were lined with old photographs, their subjects obscured by age and dust. The air felt colder here, and I could swear I sensed something lurking just beyond the edge of the light. "Is anyone here?" I called out again, but my voice sounded almost swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. I hesitated at the threshold, my instinct screaming at me to return to the safety of the elevator. But something compelled me to step forward. As I ventured out, the elevator doors closed behind me, sealing me in this unfamiliar realm. A shiver ran down my spine, and I took a deep breath, my body trembling with uncertainty. With every step I took, the feeling that I was being watched intensified, and the silence around me thickened like a suffocating fog. I pressed on, the echoes of my footsteps reverberating in the stillness. The corridor stretched ahead of me, dark and foreboding, and I could feel something in the shadows, something waiting just out of sight. I quickened my pace, the sense of dread building within me. I needed to find my room, get back to the familiar safety of my own space. But the heavy atmosphere wrapped around me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. In that moment, I knew that the Whitmore Hotel held secrets far darker than its faded grandeur suggested. And I was about to uncover them, whether I wanted to or not. The next morning, I awoke to the faint sound of the hotel's ancient pipes groaning as they settled under the weight of the day. Sunlight intruded through the thin curtains, casting a dull glow across the room. I pulled the covers tighter around me, glancing at the alarm clock, which was unhelpfully blinking 12 o'clock. I sighed, realizing I had lost track of time entirely. The memory of the elevator from the night before still lingered in my mind, a shadowy figure at the edge of my thoughts. After a quick shower, I dressed and made my way to the lobby, a place that felt both familiar and foreign. The plush carpet swallowed my footsteps as I walked past the reception desk, where a faded photograph of the hotel's opening day hung crookedly on the wall. The front desk clerk, an older gentleman with tired eyes, offered a polite nod, but I sensed a flicker of recognition in his gaze. Had he noticed my unease the night before? For breakfast, I opted for a bland muffin and a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since the dawn of time. I settled at a corner table, watching the other guests. We were all trapped in the same strange world, yet surrounded by an impenetrable veil of solitude. I could hear snippets of conversations, but they felt muffled, as if the walls of the hotel were conspiring to keep us isolated. As I contemplated my plans for the day, a rustling caught my attention. A group of tourists swarmed the elevator, their laughter echoing hollowly in the lobby. A chill danced along my spine, recalling the unsettling experience I had the night before. My instinct was to avoid the elevator entirely, but curiosity tugged at me. What lay deeper within the innards of this labyrinthine hotel? Determined to confront my fears, I stood and walked toward the elevator. I pressed the call button, wincing at the sound of the metal doors creaking open. The interior was dimly lit, the flickering light bulb above casting jittery shadows. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, the door sealing me in with a heavy thud that echoed like a drumbeat in my chest. I pressed the button for the 5th floor, where my room was situated, and felt the elevator jerk to life. The ride was disconcertingly smooth at first, but as it climbed, the air thickened and turned stale. I leaned against the wall, trying to quell my growing anxiety. Just as I thought I could weather the ride, the elevator jolted violently, and the lights flickered ominously. I gripped the railing, heart hammering in my chest, and the elevator stalled. The faint hum of machinery sputtered into silence, leaving me in an unbearable stillness. My breath quickened, and I pressed the button repeatedly, each beat met with an unsettling sense of futility. Panic tickled at the edges of my mind as I realized I was trapped. Then, as if mocking my distress, the lights flickered back to life, casting my reflection against the scratched metal walls. I noticed something peculiar just outside the panel of buttons, a shadow that seemed to ripple against the surface. It flickered again, and I blinked. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me, or was something actually there, lurking in the darkness? Time stretched, and every second felt like an eternity. I attempted to steady my breath, but the oppressive air gnawed at my throat. I envisioned 1,000 scenarios playing out in my mind, each one more horrifying than the last. What if I was stuck here forever? What if something awaited me beyond this metal shell? A sudden crash echoed above me, a sound so loud it reverberated through the elevator. I jumped, heart racing, and pressed my ear against the door, straining to listen. The muffled sounds of conversation I had heard earlier were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that settled over the hotel like a thick fog. I thought I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of life. After what felt like an eternity, I heard another noise, soft and shuffling, almost like scratching. It was coming from above, but it didn't seem human. It was a sound that sent shivers racing down my spine, clawing at my rational thoughts. Then, with a jerk and a lurch, the elevator began to move again, this time descending. I felt my stomach drop, and I clutched the railing tighter, panic rising like bile in my throat. The lights flickered once more, and I caught a glimpse of the display panel. A red light blinked ominously, indicating the elevator was headed to the basement. Basement? My mind raced with questions. Was there even a reason for a basement in this hotel? I had seen no sign of one. What could possibly be down there? The possibilities twisted my stomach into knots. As the elevator doors opened with a grinding groan, a cold wave of air rushed in, carrying with it an odor of dampness and decay. I stood frozen, the threshold before me a gaping maw, darkness spilling out like ink. This was not where I had intended to go. I inhaled, the chill seeping into my bones. I had a choice: step forward into the unknown or retreat back into the false comfort of the elevator. I hesitated, my heart pounding against my ribcage like a caged beast longing to escape. Then, as if compelled by a force I couldn't explain, I stepped forward into the shadows. The elevator doors closed behind me with a finality that echoed in the silence. My pulse raced, and I found myself enveloped in darkness, the air heavy and foreboding. I took a step further, my senses heightened, ready to confront whatever lay ahead. The next morning, I woke with a feeling of dread hanging over me like a thick fog. The hotel room, with its faint scent of mildew and a muted palette of beige and brown, felt more like a prison than a refuge. I glanced at the clock on the bedside table. It was already past 9. I had promised myself to explore the hotel, but as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, I felt an inexplicable reluctance to leave the room. After a long shower, I steeled myself for the day ahead. The steam clung to my skin, a comforting warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold grip of unease still settling in my stomach. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that I was simply tired from the travel and the unsettling dreams that had plagued my sleep. The dreams, vague but chilling, had featured the hotel's elevator, the sound of its gears grinding like a warning in the dark. I pulled on a wrinkled sweater and headed for the door, pausing to look back at the room. It felt suffocatingly silent, the kind of silence that thrums with tension. I kicked myself for being so paranoid. It was just a hotel. Nothing could be lurking behind the walls. I stepped into the corridor, the dull beige carpet absorbing the sound of my footsteps. The lobby bustled with life. A group of tourists crowded around the front desk, laughter mingling with the sound of muted television sets and the clattering of dishes from the breakfast nook. I inhaled deeply, allowing the aroma of coffee to fill my lungs, but the uneasy feeling lingered like a stubborn shadow. I had to confront it, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. I made my way to the elevator. It stood there, metal doors gleaming dully under the flickering fluorescent light. I could see my reflection in the surface. My eyes looked haunted, as if I wore the weight of a heavy secret. The elevator was small, just barely accommodating 3 people, with a brass panel of buttons that looked as though they hadn't been replaced since the hotel's opening decades ago. I hesitated, glancing at the stairwell. The stairs would be safer, but I'd done enough running from my fears. I took a deep breath and pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the elevator lurched downward. As it descended, an unsettling shudder ran through the floor beneath me, jolting my heart. I shifted my weight from foot to foot, trying to dismiss the instincts that screamed at me to get out. With a harsh jolt, the elevator stopped. The lights flickered, then dimmed, leaving me standing in eerie half-darkness. My breath quickened, and I reached out instinctively, pressing the button again. Nothing happened. The elevator remained motionless, suspended somewhere between floors. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. I felt ridiculous for sounding so frightened. What had I expected? That this would be a routine ride? I tapped my foot against the floor, my heart beat loud in the cramped space. Seconds stretched into minutes, and panic began to claw at my mind. Was I really trapped? I reached for the emergency button, only to find it was coated with a layer of dust. My fingers trembled as I pressed it. A tinny voice crackled through the intercom, too faint to understand. "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. Only silence answered. I pressed the button again, feeling a wave of claustrophobia wash over me. The elevator lurched, and for a moment, I thought it might start moving again. Instead, the lights flickered ominously. I braced myself against the wall, the chill of the metal seeping through my sweater. My thoughts spiraled, imagining the worst. What if the elevator plummeted? What if it broke down completely? And then, in the dim light, I noticed something at the corner of the ceiling, a small, dark stain, like an ink blot against the faded beige. My heart raced as I squinted at it, trying to convince myself it was just a shadow. But then, another flicker of light revealed its true nature. Something was dripping from it, a slow, rhythmic drop that echoed in the confined space. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Was it blood? I shook my head, unwilling to entertain the thought. It couldn't be. I pressed my back against the wall, heart hammering, and tried to breathe deeply. I was imagining things. The elevator lurched again, settling a little deeper. I could feel the vibrations of the building around me, the creaking of old wood and metal echoing through the air. And then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, clawing, just above the hum of the emergency lights. I strained to listen, every nerve ending on high alert. My throat constricted as I imagined what could be making that sound. I would never know, I realized, if I didn't move. I fumbled for the emergency button again, panic rising in my chest. I pressed it repeatedly, hoping against hope that someone would answer. Finally, a voice crackled through, but it was garbled and distant. "Hold on. Help is coming," the voice said, but the words felt like a cruel joke. I looked up, the stain now a dark smudge against the fading light. Whatever was up there felt closer, and I could almost sense the presence lurking just beyond sight. Time stretched, each second feeling like an eternity as the scratching grew louder. I pressed myself into the corner, feeling like prey cornered by a predator. My mind raced, searching for an escape. Just as I began to panic, the elevator jolted violently, then came to a sudden stop. The lights flickered back on, bright and harsh, flooding the space. The metal doors slid open with a soft ding, revealing the lobby on the other side. I stumbled out, legs trembling as I burst into the familiar chaos of the hotel's entrance. It was a strange juxtaposition, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, people bustling about as though nothing had happened. But I could still feel the heaviness of the elevator's grip on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out, that I was still trapped within that dark, suffocating space. I turned back, glancing over my shoulder at the elevator. It stood still, seemingly innocent, yet I could sense the darkness lurking just beyond its doors. I shivered and walked away, leaving behind the whispers of the unseen, knowing deep down that it wasn't finished with me yet. I had never thought much about elevators, but after my night in room 702, they took on a strange significance. The hotel was old, its age etched into the peeling wallpaper and the flickering lights. The elevator was a relic of that wear, a rusted metal box that groaned as it carried reluctant guests up and down. After all that had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just an inconvenient mode of transport. It felt like a trap, and I had unwittingly stepped into its jaws. The next evening found me sitting in the hotel's dimly lit lobby, a cup of bitter coffee warming my hands. My mind replayed the events of the previous night, what I had seen, what I had felt. The memory of the first scream echoed in my ears, the one that pulled me from my restless sleep. I had tried to convince myself it was just a dream, that the shadow I saw flickering in the corner of the room was merely a play of light. But the moment I stepped into the hall and found that the corridor was bathed in an unnatural chill, the truth clawed its way back up my throat. I planned to leave the hotel as soon as the morning sun cast away the shadows, but the storm outside had other intentions. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like something alive, making it impossible for me to venture outside. The other guests appeared equally trapped, huddling in dark corners, their faces obscured by an eerie gloom. I decided to return to my room, hoping the familiarity of my space would quell some of the dread that gnawed at my insides. I took a deep breath as I approached the elevator. The doors groaned open, revealing a small space that felt suffocating even under the warm glow of the overhead light. I hesitated, but the thought of climbing the stairs while the storm raged outside was less appealing than confronting the metallic beast ahead of me. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the 7th floor. The door shuttered closed, and the elevator jolted slightly as it began its ascent. My heart quickened, an involuntary response to the oppressive atmosphere. I felt as though the walls were closing in, the air thickening to a near suffocation. I focused on the numbers flickering above the door, counting down to my destination, 6, 5, 4. Then, without warning, the elevator lurched to a halt. The lights flickered, casting surreal shadows that danced along the walls. Panic clenched my stomach as I pressed the button repeatedly, each jab met with stubborn silence. I was no longer alone in the box. I sensed a presence lurking just out of sight, something that had followed me. "Hello?" I called, my voice breaking the stillness. The only response was the unsettling creak of the elevator cables. I pressed the emergency button, the shrill sound echoing in the confined space, but it only seemed to amplify the silence. I leaned against the wall, desperate to calm my racing heart, but then I heard it, a whisper, a soft breath that seemed to come from the very walls of the elevator. "Help me." The voice was weak, as if it had traveled through time to reach me. I felt chilled to my core, my mind racing back to the flickering shadow I had seen in my room. It was too much to process. I tried to convince myself it was a figment of my imagination, a trick played by the shadows, but I could not shake the feeling that someone or something was reaching out from the abyss. "Who's there?" I demanded, but all I received was another whisper, this time scraping against the walls like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Help me, please." With a sudden rush of adrenaline, I pounded on the panel, screaming for anyone to hear me. My pleas echoed, swallowed by the suffocating darkness of the elevator. The urgency clawed at me, and I turned to the doors, shaking them with all my strength. "Let me out." The whispering ceased, replaced by a heavy silence that felt alive with dread. Just when I thought I might be trapped forever, the elevator lurched back to life. With a violent shudder, it continued its journey upward. When it finally stopped, the numbers illuminated a chilling 7. The door scraped open, revealing the dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest as I peered out. The corridor was empty, an unsettling stillness enveloping me. I stepped out, half expecting to find a figure waiting, but the only thing that greeted me was the heavy scent of mold and something sweet, almost like decay. I knew I had to get to my room, but each step felt like a descent into a nightmare. The flickering lights at the far end of the hallway beckoned me closer, their glow casting long shadows that danced at the edges of my vision. I reached for my key card, my fingers trembling as I inserted it into the lock of room 702. As the door swung open, I felt an icy gust of wind rush past me. I stepped inside and closed the door tightly behind me, taking a moment to lean against it and catch my breath. The room was unchanged, yet it felt charged, as if it had absorbed the fear of the last night. I turned to scan the room, half expecting to see the shadow lurking in the corner again. But instead, I found a reflection in the mirror above the dresser. It was faint, almost translucent, but I could see the outline of a figure, an echo of someone who had once occupied the space. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "Help me," it breathed again, the voice impossibly soft, mirroring my own fear. I stumbled toward the bathroom, the need for escape overtaking my senses. But as I reached for the light switch, the power went out completely. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt the oppressive weight of whatever had been haunting me close in around me. "Please." I could feel it now, a presence that felt almost tangible. It was too late to run. The shadows swirled, pulling me deeper into their depths, and I knew then that escaping the hotel would mean more than leaving this room. It would mean confronting the darkness that had been waiting for me all along. I was still trying to shake off the dread that had settled in my bones following my earlier experiences on the 10th floor. The flickering light and the echoing silence had played tricks on my mind, but there was no denying the weight of that suffocating atmosphere. Each step through the narrow, dimly lit corridors seemed to amplify the unease within me. I could almost hear the hotel breathing, an old structure sighing under the weight of its own history. That evening, I decided to head down to the lobby for a change of scenery. Maybe I needed a drink, or perhaps just the company of fellow hotel guests. After the unsettling encounters with the elevator, I had convinced myself I was fine. I would take the stairs. I wouldn't let something as mundane as an elevator instill fear in me. The staircase felt alive, its old wood creaking under my weight. The faint scent of mildew hung in the air, mixing with the remnants of stale cigarette smoke. I paused briefly on the landing, glancing up the darkened flight that led back to my floor, wondering if I would catch a glimpse of whatever had haunted me. The thought sent a chill down my spine, and I quickly dismissed it. I pressed on, determined to reach the lobby. Reaching the first floor, the vibrant chatter of voices greeted me, and I almost felt like a weight lifted. Yet, the moment I walked into the lobby, that comfort slipped away. It was busy, yet an unsettling hush seemed to hang in the air, like anticipation before a storm. Faces turned to me briefly, only to glance away, lost in their conversations. I spotted a bar in the corner, its dim lighting inviting. A glass of something strong might relax the frayed edges of my nerves. As I perched on a bar stool, the bartender, a man with a weary expression and the look of someone who had seen too much, served me a whiskey on the rocks. The first sip burned a path down my throat, and I savored the warmth that spread through me. I could feel my muscles loosening, the tension melting away. I engaged in idle chatter with the bartender, who spoke in a low, gravelly voice about the various oddities of the hotel. I chuckled at the ghost stories that seemed to embellish the hotel's reputation, wondering how much was myth versus truth. After a few drinks, the laughter around me became a distant echo as my thoughts drifted back to my floor, to the darkness that had engulfed my experience. I felt the urge to go back up, but some instinct held me back. I observed the faded wallpaper that peeled in places, resembling the kind of long-forgotten memories that the hotel seemed to embody. I thought briefly of going back to my room, but the need to quell the unease propelled me forward. Eventually, I stood to leave, my movements slightly unsteady from the drinks. I decided to take the elevator this time, the very thing that had filled me with dread just hours ago. The lobby elevator doors were wider and less claustrophobic than the one on my floor. I pressed the button, and the elevator chimed softly as it arrived. As I stepped inside, I felt the familiar wariness creeping back. The metal interior gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but the overhead bulb flickered ominously. I hurriedly pressed the button for the 10th floor and stood back against the wall, gripping the railing as the doors closed with a heavy thud. The elevator jolted slightly as it began its ascent, the mechanical whirring loud in the confined space. Then it stopped. I leaned forward, peering out at the floor numbers above the door. The light for the 10th floor blinked unsteadily as the elevator jolted again. I felt the air thicken, and my heartbeat quickened. Something was wrong. I pressed the button multiple times, my pulse pounding in my ears, but the elevator remained stubbornly still. An unsettling silence enveloped me, broken only by the low hum of the motor and the faint creaks of the ancient machinery. I glanced at the emergency phone, contemplating whether to use it or just wait. The ding of the elevator's alert signal echoed and faded, replaced by a heavy, oppressive quiet. Suddenly, the lights flickered more violently, casting disturbing shadows within the small space. Panic surged through me. I pressed the button again, my fingers trembling. Just then, I heard it, a faint sound, like whispering, emanating from above. It was soft at first, so fleeting I might have imagined it, but it grew clearer, an incoherent murmur that scraped against my sanity. The doors rattled as if something had collided with them from outside. My heart raced. I pressed against the wall, trying to convince myself that it was just a malfunction. Just the old elevator, like the rest of the hotel, just a set of gears and wires. But the whispers continued, rising and falling, wrapping around me like a cold fog. The overhead light flickered again, and the atmosphere thickened with a palpable dread. I could swear the whispers coalesced into words I almost understood, a chant that filled the tiny room with a sense of impending doom. I wanted to scream, to pull the emergency lever, but my body felt frozen, paralyzed by fear. Then, the elevator lurched, the lights flickering out entirely. I was plunged into darkness. The whispers grew louder, almost a cacophony now. I could hear them scraping at the edges of my mind, urging me to remember something lost, something that had not yet come to light. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the buttons, desperate to break free from this metal coffin. Suddenly, the jolt came again, harder this time, as the elevator jerked violently, and the lights flickered back on, illuminating a face staring back at me through the glass. A woman, her eyes dark and hollow, twisted into an expression of forgotten grief. The image flashed and vanished, leaving only the empty reflection of my terror. I pressed the button once more, this time feeling a surge of hope as the elevator resumed its ascent. As the doors finally opened to the 10th floor, the murmuring ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence, and I stumbled out into the hallway, my heart racing and every instinct screaming at me to run. Story 3, Echoes Beneath the Canopy. The last sliver of sunlight dipped below the horizon, casting twisted shadows among the trees. I should have known better than to venture into Hollow Creek Woods as darkness fell, but curiosity had always been my weakness. It had been years since anyone dared to tread these paths, a fact I foolishly brushed aside. The stories I grew up with lingered in the back of my mind, whispers of missing townsfolk and the eerie howls that echoed through the trees. Still, the call of the unknown was too enticing to resist. As I stepped deeper into the woods, the air thickened, saturated with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. My flashlight flickered unsteadily, the beam cutting through the gathering gloom like a fragile thread. Each crunch of twigs beneath my boots felt exaggerated, breaking the silence that draped over the landscape like a heavy fog. I paused, attempting to steady my breath, letting the shadows settle around me. I had come to scout the area for my environmental project, an examination of the deforestation that had plagued this part of the woods. A part of me had hoped to capture the untouched beauty of nature, the serenity that came with isolation. But Hollow Creek Woods was anything but serene. An unsettling stillness enveloped me as if the trees themselves were engaged in a hushed conversation, sharing secrets I was not meant to hear. I trudged onward, my mind racing with thoughts of what I might find. The thicket grew denser, branches clawing at my arms as I brushed past. I remembered the stories of those who entered these woods and never returned. Each tale had a different ending, but all spoke of an insatiable darkness lurking among the trees. I suppressed a shiver, telling myself it was just my imagination. This was merely a scientific endeavor, not a ghost story. Then I heard a faint rustle that broke the silence. It came from the underbrush to my right, a low sound that seemed too deliberate, too close. I halted, my heart thumping in my chest. I trained my flashlight toward the noise, the beam trembling as I gripped the cold metal tightly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding feeble in the thickening darkness. There was no reply, just the distant chirping of crickets and the whisper of wind through the leaves. I waited, tension coiling in my gut, instinct urging me to turn back. But something compelled me to stay, to investigate the sound that could easily be dismissed as wildlife. I took a tentative step closer, my pulse quickening with each crunch of brittle leaves beneath my feet. The rustle returned, louder this time, followed by what sounded like shuffling. I scanned the area, every shadow stretching into grotesque shapes that danced on the periphery of my vision. I was about to turn back when I saw it, a pair of eyes glinting in the dark, partially hidden behind a tangle of branches. They were unnaturally bright, piercing through the night like cold stars. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. They blinked slowly, and in that moment, something primal ignited within me, fear. The eyes vanished as quickly as they appeared, and adrenaline surged through me. I turned to run, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, clawing at my clothing and skin. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing as the dim light of my flashlight wavered. I had no time to look back. All I could think about was the urgency of escaping whatever was watching me. As I dashed through the forest, the sounds of the night morphed into an unsettling chorus. The rustles grew into scrapes and low growls, a cacophony that echoed my panic. My feet pounded against the earth, and I lost all sense of direction. I didn't know which way I had come, the landmarks of familiarity swallowed by shadow. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something pursuing me. The rush of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, broke through the rhythm of my own pounding heart. I pushed myself harder, fear lending me strength. Each breath burned in my chest, the air thick with moisture and dread. I could feel it gaining on me, an unseen force that hungered for my presence. I burst into a small clearing, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing an ancient oak that stood sentinel among the trees. Panting heavily, I leaned against the rough bark, frantically scanning for a way out. My instinct screamed at me to climb, to seek refuge above the ground. But as I looked up, I saw that the branches stretched high, thick with foliage, offering no sanctuary. A rustle from behind set my heart to races again, and the fear transformed into sheer survival instinct. I kicked off my boots, shedding the weight that tethered me to the earth. I needed to escape, not just from the woods, but from whatever had turned my adventure into a nightmare. I glanced back, half expecting to see the glint of eyes again, but the darkness swallowed everything. With a desperate leap, I took off once more, ignoring the branches that snagged at my clothes. I raced forward, feeling as if I were being pulled deeper into the woods, yet still searching for an exit that remained stubbornly out of reach. My surroundings twisted and morphed, a labyrinth of shadows that conspired against me. Just as I thought I could hear distant voices, a sharp scream pierced the night air, a cry filled with terror that echoed through the trees. It was then that I understood. I wasn't the only one who had come to the woods that night. And whatever had taken notice of me had claimed others before. I pressed onward into the suffocating darkness, the stories of fate echoing in my mind, each step a march toward uncertainty. The night wrapped around me like a shroud as I stumbled deeper into the woods, a dark tide pulling me away from the last vestiges of sanity. The trees loomed like sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky, and I felt their presence weigh heavily upon my shoulders. My heart raced, each pulse a rhythm of dread urging me to turn back, to flee the depths of this ancient forest. But I couldn't. Not now. Not after what I had seen. The faintest glimmers of moonlight filtered through the dense canopy above, casting ghostly shadows that danced across the forest floor. I caught a glimpse of my breath, a misty exhalation in the chill, then pressed forward, the soft crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot a relentless reminder of my solitude. I could have sworn I heard something, a rustle beyond the veil of trees, but I pushed the notion aside. It was merely the forest adjusting to the night, I told myself. That urge to look back nagged at me, an instinct I fought against vehemently. Earlier that day, I had set out on what was supposed to be a simple hike, a short respite from the noise of everyday life. I had planned to return before dusk, but the lure of the forest had pulled me in deeper, each bend revealing more twisted paths and whispers of life. It was beautiful, in a haunting way, but now, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, I realized I had ventured too far. As I continued, I recalled the faces of my friends, their laughter echoing in my mind like a distant memory. We had come here many times, but this trip was different. The air felt thicker, laden with an energy I couldn't quite grasp. I shivered, brushing my fingers across the bark of a tree, its surface rough and wet. Something about it sent a jolt through me, a sense that it was alive in a way I could not understand. The wind whispered through the branches, a low hum that seemed to carry words from the past, and I strained to listen. Was it calling my name? I shook my head. I had to remain focused. I had to find my way back before panic consumed me. I pulled out my phone, but the screen remained dark, no signal, no hope. Just me and the suffocating silence. I pressed on, the path folding in around me as I tried to quell the rising tide of anxiety. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. Yet, I also felt an odd compulsion, as if something was directing me, drawing me toward the heart of the forest. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was something more sinister, a force that thrived on fear. Just then, I heard it again, a soft sound, like a child's giggle echoing through the trees. I halted, my breath hitching in my throat. Was it real? I stood frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. The laugh drifted nearer, twisting around me like smoke, and before I could think, I stepped toward it, compelled by an unseen hand. I moved deeper into the thicket, brushing aside low-hanging branches as they clawed at my clothes. The laughter echoed again, this time more insistent, and I felt a chill sweep through me, a warning I dared not ignore. Yet the childlike sound tugged at something deep inside me, a remnant of innocence that felt impossibly distant. I should have turned back, but I was entranced. Soon, I reached a clearing, and what I saw rooted me to the spot. In the center stood an old, decrepit cabin, half hidden by creeping vines and festooned with shadows. The wood was gray, splintered, and moss-covered, and an air of malevolence hung over it, so thick I could taste it. I stepped forward, compelled by an eerie curiosity, the laughter growing louder, weaving through the air like some haunted melody. As I approached the cabin, I noticed strange markings etched into the front door, symbols I couldn't decipher. They twisted in on themselves, dark and menacing, and I wondered if they were meant to ward off intruders or invite them in. I hesitated, all instinct screaming at me to run away, but the laughter drew me closer. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as I brushed against the cold wood. Suddenly, the laughter ceased, plunging the woods into an oppressive silence. I felt a chill skitter down my spine, as if a watchful presence hovered just beyond my sight. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the heavy weight of expectation, the feeling that I was not alone. I hesitated, caught between dread and the insistent pull to uncover whatever lay within. With a deep breath, I pushed against the door. It creaked open, revealing a dim interior that smelled of decay and something darker, something that threatened to engulf me. I stepped across the threshold, the door groaning in protest behind me. The air turned colder, and shadows flickered at the edge of my vision. Inside the cabin, the walls seemed to close in, and I felt the very essence of the forest pulse around me, alive and watching. I was no longer merely in the woods. I was part of something ancient, something that held a secret I wasn't prepared to uncover. I strained my ears, waiting for a sound, any sound, but all that greeted me was the relentless echo of my own pulse. Then, a faint noise reached me, a rustling from the far corner of the room. I turned, heart racing, as the shadows shifted, revealing a small figure crouched in the dark. I squinted, the details still murky, but the undeniable shape of a child emerged, framed by the dim light. The laughter rose again, this time not playful, but a haunting echo that seemed to reverberate in my bones. My instincts told me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor as the figure turned to face me, and I realized, with a growing dread, that I was not just in the woods anymore. I was in their realm, lost amid the whispers of the trees, ensnared by their secrets. The sun hung low in the sky, casting elongated shadows that danced through the ancient trees. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, an olfactory reminder of the forest's hidden secrets. I had hoped to find clarity, to make sense of what lurked in the shadows, but the woods only muddled my thoughts further. Each creak of a branch or rustle of underbrush sent my heart racing, as if the very forest conspired against me. After my encounter with the strange figure the day before, I had chosen to return to the heart of the woods. Something compelled me. A mixture of fear and an inexplicable pull drove me deeper into the forest. I could hear the distant call of a crow, a harsh reminder of the reality I was trying to escape. I had to confront whatever was haunting me, or I would never find peace. The deeper I walked, the fewer signs of civilization remained. The trees twisted and turned, their gnarled branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers reaching out for lost souls. I had marked my path with small stones, but their reassurance faded with each step I took. I felt unmoored, lost not just in the woods but in my own mind. Memories of laughter with friends faded, replaced by the echo of whispered warnings about this very place. As I ventured further, the light diminished, swallowed by the thickening canopy. My breaths came heavier, and with them, I became acutely aware of the silence surrounding me. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, only the sound of my heartbeat seemed to exist in that moment. I paused, straining my ears for any sign of life, but the oppressive quiet was unsettling. It was as if the forest held its breath, waiting for a revelation. Moments turned into what felt like hours as I wandered aimlessly, the weight of shadows pressing down on me. Just as I contemplated turning back, I stumbled into a small clearing. The ground was littered with smooth stones, and in its center stood a weathered stone altar, covered in moss and ivy. The sight sent chills down my spine. I approached with caution, the unease in the pit of my stomach growing heavier with each step. The altar was unremarkable yet ominous, its surface etched with symbols I couldn't comprehend. I knelt, brushing away the foliage to get a better look. My fingers traced the lines, cold and damp to the touch. I felt a shiver run through me, not just from the chill in the air but from an awareness that I was now alone. A sound, soft yet unmistakable, drifted through the trees. I turned sharply, the sensation of being watched overwhelming. Yet, when I scanned my surroundings, nothing stirred. I was alone. Ignoring the prickling fear creeping up my spine, I returned to studying the altar, hoping it might hold answers to the madness I felt enveloping me. But then I saw it, a small notch in the stone, uneven and dark. It was a perfect fit for my fingers. Against all rational thought, I pressed my hand against it. A jolt of energy surged through me, and in that instant, the world grew louder. The rustle of leaves transformed into whispers, a cacophony of voices calling out, pleading, warning. I pulled my hand back, panting as cold sweat trickled down my back. The whispers faded, replaced by an urgent rustling from the underbrush behind me. My heart pounded, primal instinct kicking in as the fear of being hunted eclipsed all other thoughts. I stumbled backward but steadied myself. It was just a deer, I told myself, trying to quell the panic. Yet, as I turned, the breath hitched in my throat. The figure from yesterday materialized, silhouetted against the waning light. It stood unnaturally still, its features obscured, yet I felt its eyes bore into me. I recognized that presence, an unsettling familiarity that made my skin crawl. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. Instead, unspeakable dread flooded my senses, paralyzing me in place. The figure gestured slowly, beckoning me forward. I was entranced, compelled to follow despite my instincts screaming to run. I stumbled toward it, my heart racing as the space between us closed. Just before I reached the entity, it faded into the darkness, leaving only an oppressive silence in its wake. I blinked, confusion swirling in my mind. Had it been real? The uncertainty gnawed at me as I turned back to the altar. Suddenly, the whispers returned with a vengeance, rising and falling like the tide, drowning my thoughts in their chaotic plea. My heart raced as I felt the weight of the forest, the heavy gaze of the trees as if they were watching, waiting for me to make a decision, to join their whispers or flee. With a primal scream, I turned and ran, branches scraping against my arms as I tore through the underbrush. I no longer cared about finding my way. I needed to escape the suffocating air, the weight of those countless eyes. As I burst into the thick foliage, the darkness consumed me, the shadows stretching long behind as I fled deeper into the heart of the woods. I didn't stop running until my breath came in ragged gasps and my legs threatened to buckle beneath me. The forest closed in, a labyrinth with no clear exit. I stumbled upon the small stream I had crossed earlier, its soothing gurgle almost comforting in comparison to the chaos within. I knelt down, splashing water on my face, trying to quell the panic that surged within me. But as I gathered myself, the whispers returned, now sharper, more insistent. They crooned promises of revelations, of truths that lay hidden. I shivered, torn between the urge to flee and the insidious curiosity that threatened to drag me back. I couldn't escape this place. Something had claimed me, and the forest's secrets were beckoning me deeper still. The woods pressed in around me, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Each step felt like a plunge deeper into a suffocating green abyss. The thick canopy above filtered the weak daylight into a sickly, muted hue, confounding my senses and distorting the sense of direction I desperately needed. I recalled the sparse map I had hastily drawn from a description I overheard at a diner. It promised a clearing, a way out, but the trees seemed determined to swallow any trace of hope. I had been walking for hours, though time had become a vague concept in this oppressive silence. The chirping of crickets had morphed into an eerie hum, and the occasional rustle of leaves could have easily been an animal or something less recognizable. My heart raced as I replayed the nights that had passed since I entered this cursed forest, a series of frantic decisions that had led me here, one wrong turn after another. The memory of the townspeople's warning echoed in my mind. "You shouldn't go in there after dark," they said, voices low and filled with unspoken fears. But the shadows were stronger than my caution. I had lost track of the sun, and the thought of nightfall creeping up on me ignited a primal dread deep within. I pressed on, fighting the urge to turn back, knowing that returning meant facing whatever had driven me here in the first place. A sudden snap of a twig pierced the silence, and I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, scanning the underbrush for any sign of a lurking predator. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out in accusation. I could feel something watching me, something alive within the thickets, but when I squinted into the darkness, I saw nothing but the shifting shadows. Instinct kicked in, and I quickened my pace, heart racing. Panic clawed at my chest, urging me to flee, but the deeper I ventured, the more entangled I became in the undergrowth. My foot snagged on a root, sending me crashing forward into a patch of damp earth. I swore under my breath as I pushed myself up, wiping the mud from my hands and glancing back. The noise had ceased, leaving behind an unsettling stillness that threatened to engulf me. I pressed on, desperate to escape this claustrophobic maze. As I turned a corner, the trees gave way to a small clearing. Relief surged through me, a momentary reprieve from the suffocating foliage. It was bare, the ground littered with leaves and twisted branches. The air felt different here, charged with an unfamiliar energy. I took a few cautious steps into the open space, striving to catch my breath. That's when I saw it, a small, dilapidated cabin nestled at the edge of the clearing. It leaned precariously to one side, its weathered wooden exterior blending almost seamlessly with the dark trunks of the surrounding trees. A chill ran down my spine as I approached, the remnants of a life long abandoned, whispering tales of loss and despair. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly with the breeze. I hesitated, torn between curiosity and trepidation. The townspeople had warned of traps and dangers lurking in these woods, but a morbid fascination urged me forward. I nudged the door with caution, and it swung open with a protesting groan. The interior was cloaked in shadows, the air stale and thick with dust. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like specters. I stepped inside, every creak of the floorboards echoing in my ears. The remains of furniture stood as ghostly figures, shrouded in decay, a table, a chair, and a few remnants of what could have been a life lived here. A sense of melancholy enveloped me, as if the very walls were steeped in sorrow. I moved cautiously, drawn to what appeared to be a fireplace at the end of the room. The mantel was cluttered with objects, each more unsettling than the last. Old photographs, faded and cracked, stared back at me, their subjects lost to time. Faces twisted in joy that seemed to mock the present, laughter frozen in a moment before catastrophe. I shivered, wondering what had happened here, who had once called this place home. As I sifted through the remnants, my fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound journal. It felt warm, a stark contrast to the coldness that enveloped the cabin. I hesitated only a moment before flipping it open, the pages yellowed and brittle. The scrawl was shaky, frantic, detailing a descent into madness. "They come at night," one entry warned. "They watch. They listen. You can't escape." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I read further. The author spoke of whispers in the dark, shadows that danced just beyond the edge of sight. The last entry abruptly ended mid-sentence, ink smeared as if the writer had been interrupted by something too horrific to continue. A noise outside, soft and deliberate, snapped me out of my trance. My heart thundered as I turned towards the door, dread flooding my veins. I stepped back, instinctively clutching the journal to my chest. The noise grew closer, a gentle rustling followed by a low, guttural sound that filled the air with a sense of impending doom. I glanced back at the door, options racing through my mind. There was no way to hide in the small cabin, nowhere to escape. The fading light urged me to act. I had to leave, but the forest held me in its grip, a predator waiting for its prey. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever lay ahead. The world outside was waiting, and I had no idea if it would welcome me back or if the forest would claim me as its own. With a final glance at the suffocating shadows of the cabin, I stepped out, the weight of the journal heavy in my hands and the darkness closing in behind me. The sun hung low in the sky, its fading light casting long shadows that danced among the ancient trees. I had lost all sense of time, wandering deeper into the heart of the woods. The forest felt alive, but not in a comforting way. It whispered secrets I was never meant to hear. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing, and I cursed myself for straying so far from the campsite. It had been 2 days since we'd started our hike, a journey meant to reconnect with nature before the inevitable onset of winter. I remembered the laughter around the campfire, but that warmth had long since been swallowed by the encroaching chill of dusk. My friends had insisted on exploring the nearby caves while I had opted for the solace of the forest. Now, I regretted my decision. The path I had taken was nothing more than a faint trail, barely visible amidst the towering trees. I had followed it instinctively, but it soon faded into a labyrinth of underbrush and thickets. I could hear the distant echo of my friends' voices, or perhaps it was simply a trick of the wind. I called out, hoping to hear them respond, but my voice fell flat against the stillness, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. As the last rays of sunlight were extinguished, the forest transformed. Shadows elongated, reaching out like twisted fingers. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction felt foreign. Panic twisted in my gut as I stumbled over exposed roots, my breath coming in quick gasps. Then came the noise. A low growl rumbled somewhere nearby, too primal and deep to be the sound of any animal I knew. Adrenaline surged through me, and I froze, straining to hear. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. It was a sound that echoed the fears buried deep within me, a reminder that I was utterly alone, isolated by an ancient wilderness that seemed indifferent to my plight. I took a step back, my foot thudding against something solid. I turned slowly, heart racing, and faced what lay behind me. A pair of eyes glimmered in the dimming light, reflecting a feral hunger. My breath caught in my throat. There, crouched among the ferns, was something I had never seen before. It was not quite an animal, but not entirely human either. Its limbs were elongated, fingers twisted into sharp points that dug into the earth. It was covered in matted fur, its face a grotesque blend of features that hovered between predator and prey. The creature watched me with a chilling stillness, its eyes boring into mine. I fought the urge to scream, forcing my feet to move instead. I turned and ran, branches whipping against my skin as I plunged through the undergrowth. The growl followed me, a guttural promise of what awaited should I falter. I was lost, but I had to keep moving. I stumbled away from the trail, deeper into the woods, trying to outpace the horror that nipped at my heels. My senses heightened, every sound became amplified. The rustle of leaves felt like whispers urging me to turn back, the snapping of twigs an indictment of my foolishness. A sudden sharp pain bloomed in my ankle as I tripped over an exposed root, sending me sprawling to the ground. I gasped, struggling to breathe through the panic, and tried to rise. My hands dug into the damp earth for support, but the creature's growl resonated again, closer this time. I scrambled back, cradling my injured foot as I looked around. The shadows pressed in around me, suffocating, and the trees loomed like ancient sentinels, indifferent to my plight. Clouds drifted in front of the moon, cloaking the woods in darkness. I needed to hide. I spotted a dense thicket a few yards away and, with a burst of adrenaline, crawled toward it. The branches were sharp against my skin, but I forced myself to push through, concealing myself beneath a mass of brambles. I held my breath, my heart pounding against my ribs, praying that the creature would lose my scent. Silence enveloped me, but it felt wrong, heavy, expectant. I waited, ears straining for any sign of movement. The growl returned, reverberating through the trees, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. My pulse quickened, and I fought the urge to scream. I could see a shadow moving through the trees, an amorphous shape that paused, sniffing at the air. I held perfectly still, hoping against hope that the thicket would be enough to hide me. The creature prowled closer, and I caught glimpses of its grotesque features, a nightmare born of the forest's darkest corners. Then, with a jolt, it stopped, its attention captured by something else, a rustle beyond the thicket. It turned, the growl dissipating into a low whimper as it slinked away. I dared not move, still paralyzed by fear, listening as whatever had drawn its attention moved through the woods. Gradually, I gathered my courage and peered through the brambles. I saw the creature, now stalking a different prey, moving stealthily along a path that had been concealed from my view. As it vanished into the shadows, the oppressive weight of fear began to lift, but I knew I had to leave my hiding spot, and quickly. With my heart still racing, I forced myself to rise, wincing as my ankle protested. The cool night air pricked at my skin, but I needed to find my friends, to escape this nightmare. I crept back toward the path I had once followed, cautious of any sound, terrified of what might still lurk within the shadows. And as I stepped back onto the path, a bone-chilling realization washed over me. I was not just lost, the forest was alive with something far more ancient and sinister than I could comprehend. Story 4: Echoes of the Forgotten Grove. The sun dipped below the horizon when I arrived at Trenton Nature Preserve, casting long shadows that twisted and curled around the trees like hungry fingers. I had driven 2 hours from the city, leaving behind the noise and the flickering lights of civilization, seeking solace in the whispers of the forest. The preserve was a sprawling expanse of untouched land, known for its rugged beauty and the occasional encounter with wildlife. I thought I was escaping the mundane, but a sense of foreboding settled in my stomach as I stepped out of my car. The gravel crunched beneath my boots, each step echoing in the stillness. I had planned to hike the trails for a few hours before finding a secluded spot to camp, but now, With darkness creeping in, I felt an unsettling weight pressing down on me. I brushed off the feeling, attributing it to the isolation. After all, nature was meant to be embraced, not feared. As I made my way down the main path, the trees loomed overhead like ancient sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the occasional rustle of underbrush reminded me I was not alone. I stopped to listen, heart thrumming in my chest, but only the wind responded, whistling softly through the trees. I pressed on, reluctance churning in my stomach. I had heard the stories, of course. Tales of hikers who had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but faint footprints and unanswered questions. Even in the city, people spoke in hushed tones about the darker side of the preserve, whispers of sightings and shivers down spines. I dismissed them as folklore, nothing more than cautionary tales designed to thrill and frighten. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, the shadows grew thicker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were closing in around me, watching, waiting. Minutes turned into an hour, and the sun finally surrendered to night. I realized I needed to find a campsite, so I veered off the main path, guided by the faint glimmer of moonlight. The underbrush was thick, tugging at my clothes with every step. Each snap of a twig beneath my feet echoed through the silence, a reminder that I was intruding on a world that thrived beyond my understanding. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon a small clearing, a perfect spot to pitch my tent. The area felt oddly tranquil, with the gentle rustling of leaves overhead and the distant call of a night owl. I set to work, unrolling my tent and preparing my minimalist campsite. Once I had everything in place, I lit a small campfire, its glow flickering in the gloom, casting dancing shadows around me. As I sat by the fire, I relaxed, allowing the warmth to envelop me. I had brought a few snacks and a thermos of coffee, which I sipped slowly, watching the flames consume the kindling. But, with solitude came the creeping sensation of being watched. I shrugged it off, attributing my unease to the forest's dark corners and the unfamiliarity of my surroundings. Night settled in completely, blanketing the forest. The sounds of wildlife grew louder, a cacophony of calls and rustles that seemed to be celebrating the darkness. I felt small, insignificant against the symphony of the wild. It was then that I noticed it, a shifting in the brush just beyond the edge of the clearing. My heart skipped a beat, and I strained to peer into the shadows, but saw nothing. I convinced myself it was merely a deer, perhaps a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the tingle of apprehension creeping up my spine. As the night deepened, the air turned colder, and the fire flickered against the chill. I began to hear things, voices. No, not voices exactly, but low murmurs that seemed to drift from the trees. I shook my head, chastising myself for letting my imagination run wild. But the murmurs grew louder, coalescing into words, although I could make out no distinct meaning. A sudden rustle interrupted my thoughts. I turned sharply, my eyes scanning the darkness. I felt a rush of adrenaline, heart pounding in my ears. The air was charged, heavy with an unseen presence. I reached for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I took a deep breath, attempting to regain my composure. It was just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. Nature was alive with sound, a living tapestry filled with whispers of life. I forced a laugh, attempting to defuse the tension, but it echoed hollow in the night. Just as I began to settle back into my chair, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, weaving through the underbrush. I stood, instinctively gripping the flashlight tighter. My heart raced as I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice trembled, barely cutting through the darkness. Silence answered. Then, just beyond the trees, came that whisper again, a strange, indecipherable murmur. It felt close, terrifyingly so, as if the forest itself were speaking secrets among the branches. I stepped toward the noise, curiosity blending with fear, taking care to keep my flashlight steady in front of me. "Who's there?" I called again, the unease coiling tighter in my gut. But the only reply was the rustle of leaves, as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting for something hidden to unfold. The morning fog clung to the ground like a shroud, twisting around the gnarled roots of the trees that loomed overhead. I remember standing still at the entrance of the nature preserve, its well-worn sign half hidden by a tangle of wildflowers and weeds. Wildwood Preserve, it read, a name that had once beckoned with promises of serene trails and vibrant wildlife. Now, it felt more like a warning. The night before had been restless, plagued by shadows dancing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I had come here seeking solitude, a chance to escape the chaos of my life and the gnawing grief that clung to me like the dampness in the air. What I found instead was an unsettling quiet, the kind that seemed to vibrate with unspoken threats. I shook off the memory, urging myself to focus on the path ahead. With each step, the world narrowed around me, the trees arching overhead like ancient sentinels. Their twisted branches seemed to whisper secrets, the undercurrent of their rustling leaves sending shivers down my spine. I had read the brochures and heard the stories of the preserve, tales of lost hikers and strange happenings, but I had never believed them. Until now. As I ventured deeper, the sunlight struggled to break through the dense canopy above. My footsteps crunched against the fallen leaves and twigs, the sounds amplified in the eerie stillness. I paused to catch my breath, glancing around. There was something unsettling about the silence, an absence of sounds I had expected. No birds chirped, no squirrels scurried. Just the echo of my own heartbeat. I pressed on, my instincts prickling. As I turned a bend in the path, I saw something ahead, a clearing bathed in a soft, almost ethereal light. It was breathtaking, the sort of scene one might find on a postcard. Wildflowers carpeted the ground, a riot of colors splashing against the green. In the center stood an ancient oak, its trunk twisted and gnarled, the bark scarred with deep fissures. Yet, instead of awe, a chill slithered down my spine. I approached cautiously, drawn inexplicably to the tree. Its size was imposing, but it was the way the branches seemed to reach out, as if beckoning me closer, that unnerved me. I touched the rough bark, half expecting it to be warm from the sun, but it was cold, almost clammy to the touch. A sudden rustle in the underbrush made me jump, and I turned sharply, my heart racing. Nothing. Just the wind whispering through the leaves, a cruel reminder of my solitude. A sense of unease settled over me as I backed away from the tree, my instincts screaming that I needed to leave. I turned to retrace my steps but hesitated, drawn to a strange sound, an echo, perhaps, or a distant murmur. It was coming from deeper within the trees. I wanted to ignore it, to forget that I had ever entered this place, but curiosity drew me back. The path narrowed as I walked between the trees, each step heavier than the last. The air grew denser, and the sunlight faded, engulfed by the shadows of the forest. As I walked, I tried to reassure myself that I was alone, but that thought was soon shattered by a low growl that reverberated through the silence. I froze. The sound was primal, jagged, an unmistakable warning that cut through the tension of the air. My heart raced, pounding in my ears as I clutched the flashlight tighter, its beam flickering in the dim light. I couldn't tell where the sound had come from, only that it had been close enough to chill my bones. The darkness around me felt alive, the trees closing in as if conspiring against my escape. I turned back, suddenly desperate for the safety of the trail. My pulse thundered in my throat as I stumbled, panic gripping me. The path was a twisting maze, and the trees seemed to shift, altering my sense of direction. I had a fleeting thought of the stories I heard, of people who wandered too far into the woods, never returning. I called out, my voice thin and uncertain, "Hello?" The echo shivered back at me, a mocking response. Silence settled once more, but now it felt different, charged and heavy. Fear clawed at my throat, and I bolted forward, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark like a lifeline. Every rustle felt like a pursuit, every shadow a lurking threat. Then, I saw it. A figure, half obscured by the underbrush, its shape human yet distorted, crouched low to the ground. My breath hitched, and I squinted against the beam of my flashlight to bring it into focus, dread pooling in my stomach. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, but I could feel its gaze boring into me, pinning me in place. I took a step back, and that single movement seemed to awaken it. The creature's head tilted, and even in the dim light, I could see its eyes glinting like shards of glass, cold, unyielding. I turned to run, but the forest had changed, branches snapping underfoot, the path obscured by shadows. I stumbled blindly, adrenaline pushing me forward, but the growling returned, now closer, echoing from all sides. With every breath, the air thickened, and the oppressive silence was replaced by something else, a chorus of whispers that filled the trees, wrapping around me like a vine. I felt them tugging at my mind, urging me to join them, to surrender to the shadows. I ripped my eyes away from the figure and focused on the path, heart pounding violently as the world blurred around me. I had to get out. I had to escape. But with every step I took, time blurred, and I felt trapped in a loop, as if the woods themselves conspired to keep me within their grasp. When I finally broke free into a clearing, I gasped for breath, my eyes darting frantically. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, the shadows stretching ominously. And behind me, I felt it again, the weight of unseen eyes, the pull of something lurking just beyond my sight. I had come searching for solace, but instead, I had uncovered something far more sinister. And I realized then that I might not be alone in Wildwood Preserve after all. The morning light filtered through the tangled branches above, casting a dappled pattern on the forest floor. As I stepped deeper into the nature preserve, the air grew thick with an unsettling stillness. The cheerful chirping of birds seemed muted, as if they dared not break the heavy silence that blanketed the woods. I had ventured out with the hope of finding solace, yet with each footfall, a sense of dread tightened its grip around my chest. My mind replayed the events of the previous day, a picture of my mother's frantic expression as she begged me to stay away from this place. "It's not safe," she'd warned, her voice trembling with an urgency I couldn't quite understand. But I felt drawn to the preserve, almost as if it were calling to me. Maybe I was just trying to escape the weight of grief that clung to me like a second skin after my father's sudden passing. I followed the narrow trail, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots the only sound in the oppressive silence. My senses heightened, each rustle of the underbrush sent a shiver down my spine. I had heard stories about the preserve, local legends that spoke of strange occurrences and whispers in the wind, but those stories felt more like fabrications than truth. At least, that's what I told myself. A sudden rustling nearby made me stop, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned, squinting into the dense foliage, but nothing emerged. I could feel the hairs on my neck stand on end as a gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the faintest trace of something not quite right. It smelled earthy, but beneath that lay a rancid undercurrent that made my stomach churn. I pressed on, forcing my legs to move, determined to shake off the creeping sense of foreboding. The path wound deeper into the trees, and I clutched my camera, searching for any sign of beauty to capture. The vibrant greens and browns of the forest should have been soothing, yet they loomed around me like watchful eyes. I tried to focus on the art of photography, a flick of the shutter, and I could turn this somber place into something beautiful, something I could share with the world. I spotted a clearing up ahead, the sunlight spilling onto a patch of wildflowers that danced in the wind. Eager to document the scene, I hurried toward it, my apprehension slowly receding. As I crouched to get the perfect angle, a low growl resonated from the woods, freezing me in place. My heart plummeted. I turned slowly, scanning the trees for the source of the sound. The growl came again, deeper this time, a accompanied by a rustling that felt far too deliberate to be mere wildlife. Some instinct told me to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. It was a foolish attempt at bravery, but I needed to break the silence. All I received in response was the echo of my own voice fading into the woods. The growl rumbled one last time, and then, abruptly, silence returned. I took a hesitant step back toward the path, but the feeling of being watched enveloped me again, prickling at the back of my neck. I could sense something lurking just beyond the trees, hidden in the shadows, its presence tangible yet invisible. I turned and sprinted, dodging branches that clawed at my skin as I tore through the underbrush. Panic surged within me, propelling me forward as I burst back onto the trail. The sunlight seemed to mock me now, warming my skin while an icy fear coursed through my veins. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I fought the urge to look back, knowing that doing so would only invite the horror that I could feel at my heels. I stumbled across the remnants of a fallen tree, nearly losing my balance as I clambered over it. I had to get out of this place. I could almost hear my mother's voice echoing in my mind, a warning layered with dread. I pushed harder, my legs burning, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever dwelled in the shadows. It was then that I noticed something gleaming just off the path. I skidded to a halt, drawn by the peculiar sight. Partially buried in the dirt, a tarnished locket caught the sunlight. My heart raced, mingling curiosity with fear. I knelt to pick it up, wiping away the grime with trembling fingers. The locket opened with a soft click, revealing a faded photograph of a woman whose eyes seemed to bore into my soul. Beneath the picture, an inscription read, "Always watchful." A chill cascaded down my spine, and I dropped the locket as if it burned my skin. I glanced around, an overwhelming sense of paranoia clawing at my mind. The growl echoed in my memory, and I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me, intent on holding me captive. I turned to leave, but the heavy air shifted again, thickening with malice. An overwhelming sense of dread stole my breath. I knew, deep in my bones, that I was now alone. As the shadows closed in, I bolted down the path once more, the forest echoing with an unseen presence. The oppressive silence had morphed into a suffocating atmosphere, as if the trees themselves were complicit in the terror lurking just beyond sight. I needed to escape. The nature preserve, with its secrets and its watchful eyes, had become a labyrinth of horror, and I was undeniably lost within its grasp. The following morning brought with it a heavy, gray sky that hung low over the nature preserve. I blinked against the dim light filtering through the branches, the eerie silence wrapping around me like a cold, damp shroud. Even the birds seemed muted, their usual morning calls swallowed by a pressing dread that nestled in my stomach. It felt as if the forest knew, as if it had witnessed something it couldn't bear to speak of. I had spent the previous night tossing and turning in my sleeping bag, the specters of my imagination weaving nightmares from the events of the day before. I felt the weight of the woods pressing in on me, shadows stretching like fingers across the ground. As I stepped outside my tent, the dew-soaked grass chilled my bare feet, a reminder that I was still very much part of this world, a world that had taken a sharp turn toward the grotesque. After breakfast, I gathered my courage and decided to explore deeper into the heart of the preserve. My instinct screamed that the answer to the mystery lay beyond the familiar trails. The overgrown path I chose seemed to have been neglected for years, branches clawing at my clothes as I pushed my way through the underbrush. Each snap of a twig echoed through the silence, a reminder of my intrusion. The deeper I went, the stronger the sense of being watched became. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see eyes peering from the thickets. Each rustle in the undergrowth sent adrenaline coursing through my veins, but curiosity propelled me forward. It was as if the woods themselves beckoned me to uncover their secrets. As I walked, I recalled the stories shared by the park rangers about the preserve being home to rare species, yet there was something unsettling about the overgrown vegetation and thickening mist. It choked the air, giving rise to a heavy sense of decay. I found a clearing eventually, a breath of space in an otherwise suffocating wilderness. In the center of the clearing lay a stone altar, half covered in moss and flanked by gnarled trees that twisted grotesquely toward the sky. I approached cautiously, heart pounding in rhythm with my footsteps. Scratches and symbols marred the surface of the stone, ancient and unsettling. The air turned bitter as I traced the markings with my fingers, feeling an inexplicable heaviness settle in my chest. Suddenly, a crackling sound shattered the stillness. I turned, instinctively clutching the knife I kept at my side. The sensation of being watched intensified, prickling at the nape of my neck. A figure emerged from the shadows, an old man, his hair long and wild, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. He tilted his head, a strange smile creeping across his face, revealing teeth stained with something darker than just age. "My name is Enoch," he said, his voice raspy, as if he hadn't spoken in years. "You shouldn't be here. This place, it remembers." "Remembers what?" I pressed, curiosity battling my instincts to flee. Enoch took a step closer, and I could see the hollowness of his cheeks, the way his skin seemed to cling to his bones as if it were too afraid to let go. "The sacrifices," he whispered. "The forest demands them. It watches, waiting for the right offering. It knows when someone has stepped off the path. You can feel it, can't you?" I should have turned and run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. "Sacrifices?" I echoed, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "You mean to tell me?" "Yes," he interrupted, his voice rising in urgency. "The forest yearns. It hungers for more than just the flesh of the lost. It craves memories, regrets, and fears. You must leave before it takes notice of you." The very air around me thickened, the atmosphere pulsing with an unseen energy. I took a step back, my heart racing as the shadows deepened, and for a moment, I thought I saw the trees shift, their branches twisting unnaturally, as if reaching for me. Enoch's eyes widened, and he stepped back as well, glancing nervously towards the encroaching darkness. Clarity struck me then, slicing through the fog of confusion. I had come to this preserve searching for solace, but had unwittingly ventured into a trap laid out by nature itself, a predator cloaked beneath the guise of beauty. Panic surged, and I turned on my heels, sprinting back the way I had come. The forest roared to life around me, branches snapping like bones, the underbrush grabbing at my legs as if trying to hold me back. I could hear Enoch shouting behind me, but his words mingled with the cacophony of rustling leaves and a rising wind that seemed to whip through the trees, howling like a distant scream. I stumbled, falling to the ground, panic igniting my instincts. I was losing my grip on reality, the forest pushing against me, pressing me into the earth. I gasped for breath, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I could feel the weight of the woods closing in, suffocating me. Finally, I scrambled to my feet and ran, my mind racing as the path twisted and turned before me. I had to escape before I became part of whatever grisly secret held sway over this place. The clearing faded behind me, the altar and its unspeakable history lost to the shadows of the trees, but the feeling of being hunted lingered, a cold grip around my throat. I burst back onto familiar ground, the trail I had initially followed now bathed in the gray light of day. I could still hear the wind howling behind me, the forest screaming its protest as I fled. The realization settled in like the damp air, this nature preserve harbored not just beauty, but a darkness that threatened to consume all who ventured too far. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness as I stepped further into the heart of the nature preserve. The midday sun, once a comforting companion, struggled to break through the dense canopy overhead. Shadows clung to the underbrush like secrets, and every rustle of leaves echoed ominously in the silence. I had come seeking answers, but but what I found instead was a growing sense of dread that gnawed at my insides. 2 days had passed since I discovered the faded map stuffed in the attic, its corners worn and edges frayed. The preserved land, as I learned, was a remnant of an era when nature was revered and protected. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something much darker, a trap laid out over decades. As I ventured deeper, the trail became less defined, swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. Every step felt like an intrusion, a disrespectful footfall upon sacred ground. My thoughts drifted back to the stories I had heard, whispers about disappearances, strange sightings, and the ghostly figures that supposedly roamed these woods at night. They told of people who entered the preserve and were never seen again, leaving behind only echoes of their last screams. The sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows that danced menacingly around me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, a warning that perhaps I should turn back. But I pressed on, fueled by a mix of fear and determination. There was something here, something waiting to be unearthed, an urgency that propelled me forward, even as the atmosphere thickened with foreboding. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon an old, crumbling stone structure, half buried in the undergrowth. Vines wrapped around the weathered stones like the fingers of long dead hands, clutching at the past. My heartbeat quickened as I approached, curiosity battling with an instinctive urge to flee. The building seemed to pulse with life, as if the very earth around it held its breath. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, illuminating fragments of what once might have been the remnants of a forgotten history. A chill settled in my bones, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pressed my back against the cold, rough wall, trying to steady my racing heart. As I stepped further into the darkness, I noticed something on the floor. It was a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, the ink faded yet legible. I knelt, uncovering it from a layer of dust. The script was shaky, frantic. The last entry spoke of something lurking within the preserve, a presence that could not be described. The writer mentioned shadows that moved independently, eyes that glowed like fiery coals, and cries that echoed through the trees, an eternal chorus of despair. "Leave while you can," the final line warned, scrawled with urgency. My pulse raced. I had ignored the warnings of the townsfolk, but this was different. Whoever had penned these words had felt the same ominous pressure, the same suffocating dread. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone or something waiting in the corners of the room. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I sensed movement in my periphery, a flicker of dark against the mottled light. Turning sharply, my breath caught in my throat. There was nothing, just the shadows shifting like restless spirits. Still, my instinct screamed that I was not alone. I stood, clutching the journal tightly, its pages crinkling under the pressure of my grip. The weight of the unknown grew unbearable. My mind raced with possibilities. What had happened to the previous occupants of this place? Where had the author gone? I decided I had lingered long enough. As I retraced my steps, an unsettling noise broke through the silence. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the walls. It was a sound I had never heard before, raw and primal. My heart thundered in my chest as I quickened my pace, my feet stumbling over the uneven floor. The growl was building into a cacophony of snarls and snaps, echoing throughout the structure, each note resonating with primal fear. I burst out of the building into the dense underbrush, eyes wide, my breath coming in short gasps. The vibrant greens of the forest seemed to twist into an oppressive weight. My instincts kicked in, urging me to run. I could feel it gaining on me, whatever darkness had stirred from its slumber. Branches whipped against my skin as I stumbled down the trail, the underbrush clinging to my clothes as if trying to pull me back. The growls echoed behind me, taunting, a dark melody of pursuit. Panic surged through me. I was acutely aware of every sound, every rustle, as if the forest itself was coming alive, conspired against me. I reached the edge of the clearing where the trees opened up to reveal the sun dipping below the horizon, casting an eerie twilight glow. I hesitated, torn between the safety of the clearing and the certainty of the danger behind me. But as the sound intensified, the instinct to survive overwhelmed my indecision. I plunged into the open, heart pounding, racing toward the distant outline of my car. I needed to escape this cursed place, to put miles between myself and whatever hunted me through the trees. As I reached the vehicle, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, the growl morphing into something more sinister. Closer now. With a final burst of adrenaline, I unlocked the door, jumped inside, and slammed it shut. I turned the key in the ignition, praying for the engine to roar to life. The growl escalated into a chilling crescendo, echoing in tandem with the thrum of my heart, filling the space with an ominous finality. The engine sputtered, then roared. I peeled out of the clearing, my gaze fixed on the dimming forest in the rearview mirror. As the trees receded into the shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me from the depths of the preserve, something that would not let me go. Story 5, Night Shift, The Watchers Within. The air was thick with anticipation as I took my place behind the security desk in the dimly lit foyer of Eldridge Manufacturing. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, a reminder of my solitary vigil. My shift began at 11, just as darkness clawed at the edges of the sprawling factory complex, and I could already feel an unsettling chill creeping into the corners of my mind. Eldridge had long since ceased operations, its cavernous buildings left to time and decay. Rumors swirled among the townsfolk about the ghosts that haunted its massive halls, whispers of a tragic accident that took the lives of 3 workers decades ago. I had never given much credence to such tales. However, as I settled into my chair, a twinge of dread settled in my stomach, fed by the shadows lurking just beyond the reach of the flickering fluorescent lights. The first hour passed with the monotony typical of a security shift. My only company was the sporadic rustle of the wind outside and the soft hum of the security cameras. I flipped through the pages of a dog-eared novel, but the words blurred together as I instinctively checked the monitors. The screens displayed the desolate hallways of the factory, long, empty, and echoing with a silence that felt almost palpable. It was past midnight when the first oddity occurred. A flicker on one of the monitors caught my attention. I squinted, leaning forward as the grainy image resolved into the basement entrance. Even from the surveillance feed, I could sense something wrong. The door, which had been firmly shut during my rounds, was now ajar. I felt my heart begin to race, a primal instinct clawing at my rational mind. Grabbing my flashlight, I rose from my seat. The sound of my footsteps reverberated through the empty lobby, a haunting reminder of my isolation. I knew I should report the anomaly. Protocol dictated that I contact the local authorities, but something more profound urged me to investigate further. Perhaps the stories had begun to seep into my consciousness. As I approached the basement stairs, the air grew colder, and the shadows deepened. With each step into the dark, a sense of foreboding wrapped around me like a shroud. My flashlight beam cut through the blackness, illuminating peeling paint and old machinery that had long since fallen into disuse. The faint smell of rust and decay clawed at my nostrils as I descended, each creak of the wooden steps echoing like a warning. When I reached the bottom, the door creaked open wider, as if inviting me in. I hesitated, my breath hitching in my throat. There was a stark difference between the eerie calm above and the oppressive silence below. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the walls around me. Peering into the basement, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moved brief, almost imperceptible. I turned quickly, adrenaline surging, but there was nothing. Just the heavy stillness of the air pressing down on me like a weight. I flicked off my flashlight, allowing my eyes to adjust to the darkness. The blackness loomed, thick and suffocating. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to retreat back to the safety of the lobby. Instead, I took a deep breath and called out, my voice echoing mockingly through the empty space. "Hello? Is anyone down there?" No response. Just the silence of the factory and the faint sound of dripping water somewhere in the distance. I took a step further into the basement, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and an unspeakable dread. The beam of my flashlight trembled in my grip as I swept it across the room, revealing old crates and broken machinery, all shrouded in darkness. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the room, partially obscured by shadows. I froze, the blood draining from my face. My mind raced through possibilities, rational thoughts struggling to assert themselves against a wave of panic. Was it a trick of the light? Had someone else come to investigate? "Who's there?" I shouted, trying for firmness but sounding more like a child than a security guard. The figure didn't move. It merely stood there, an ominous silhouette against the wall, unmoving and silent. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back. I took a cautious step forward, flashlight raised, heart pounding audibly in my chest. "Show yourself." The figure shifted slightly, and just as my flashlight beam landed on it, it vanished into the darkness, as if swallowed whole by the shadows. For a split second, I stood frozen in disbelief. I willed myself to think logically. It was just my imagination. I stepped back, my instinct roaring for me to retreat, but I found myself moving forward again, against all better judgment. The basement stretched on, dark and foreboding, filled with the remnants of a place long abandoned. My flashlight flickered, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening, an almost tangible force that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The farther I ventured from the stairwell, the more isolated I felt, as if the shadows were consuming me whole. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, though I couldn't make out the words. The sound crawled under my skin, and my breath quickened. I spun around, shining the light in every direction, but the basement remained still and quiet. A part of me screamed to flee, to abandon my post in that wretched place, but I felt an inexplicable pull. As I deliberated, a sudden, loud bang echoed in the distance, reverberating through the industrial hollowness. I jumped, adrenaline surging through me. I didn't need to consider what it could be. I was no longer alone. The day after I was hired, the darkness settled over the old warehouse like a thick, suffocating cloak. I was assigned to the night shift, a schedule that was as eerie as the place itself. The creaking walls and the faint hum of the ancient machinery sent a chill down my spine. I arrived at dusk, the sun a dwindling ember on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like skeletal fingers reaching for me. The head guard, Frank, met me at the entrance, his expression unreadable under his flat cap. "You'll be fine," he assured me, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Just keep your eyes open. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't like visitors." He chuckled, but the laugh didn't reach his eyes. They were too tired, too haunted. I dismissed it as nervous banter, but a creeping unease settled in the pit of my stomach. The vastness of the warehouse was imposing. Empty crates loomed like gravestones in the dim light of the overhead bulbs, their flickering luminescence creating a strobe effect across the concrete floor. I was given a flashlight, a walkie-talkie, and a monotonous schedule of patrols to follow. Check the perimeter every hour. If you see anything unusual, call it in, Frank advised, his gaze flicking to the shadows as if they contained secrets he wasn't willing to share. The first hour passed in a blur of mundane sounds, the groan of metal against metal, the soft scuttle of rodents hidden in the corners. I fought the urge to jump at every echo. The isolation was palpable, amplifying each creak and whisper, transforming the benign into the sinister. I hovered around the loading docks, the air thick with the scent of rust and decay. As the clock struck midnight, I began my first patrol, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. My footsteps echoed, blending with the ambient sounds of the warehouse. I moved slowly, an involuntary shiver racing along my spine whenever I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. The shadows danced in ways they shouldn't, and I found myself questioning every flicker, every ripple of the darkness. Around the halfway point of my round, I noticed a door slightly ajar at the far end of the building. It wasn't on my list of checkpoints. I approached cautiously, the heavy door creaking ominously as I nudged it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dampness and neglect. My flashlight revealed a small office cluttered with dusty files and abandoned furniture, but what caught my attention was the wall filled with photographs. They were old and frayed, depicting the warehouse in its prime, workers smiling, machines whirring, a life that felt light years away. But there was something unsettling about the photographs. As I stepped closer, I noticed the figures in the background. Shadows that loomed just beyond the edges of the frames, their features obscured. I felt a rush of unease wash over me, an instinctive urge to flee. I turned to leave when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the small space. My heart raced, pounding in my ears. I aimed my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam faltered, flickering as if sensing something it couldn't confront. A chill settled over me, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand at attention. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing as I threw the door open wider and bolted out into the main floor. I gasped for breath, the growl echoing in my mind, twisting into something darker. It couldn't have been real. Surely it was just my imagination playing tricks in the oppressive silence. I forced myself to resume my patrol, focusing on the task, trying to ignore the unease simmering beneath my skin. As I rounded a corner, I caught sight of Frank in the distance, his silhouette outlined by the dim light. He seemed to be talking into his walkie-talkie. I trudged toward him, eager to share my experience. But as I approached, he turned sharply, his face pale and eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he hissed, his voice trembling. "Hear what?" I asked, confusion clouding my thoughts. "The growl." I thought I was imagining it, he stuttered, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to materialize from the shadows. It wasn't just me, then? I felt both relieved and terrified. "We've lost guards here before," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They heard something and went after it. It's never a good sign." A cold realization settled over me. I wasn't just patrolling a warehouse. I was a sentinel against something unknown and possibly malevolent. "What do you mean, lost? Like, missing?" Frank nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yeah. Just be careful. If you hear anything, don't approach it. Call it in. Don't make the same mistakes." The weight of his words pressed heavily on my chest. The hours dragged on, each tick of the clock sending ice through my veins. I resumed my patrol, my senses heightened, every creak and rustle magnified in the stillness of the night. Somewhere deep within the shadows, I felt the presence again. A weight, heavy and watching, lurking just beyond my field of vision. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, the beam trembling as my heart raced. I moved hesitantly, the urge to flee clawing at my mind, but the thought of what I might leave behind kept me rooted to the spot. Why had I chosen this job? As the minutes wore on, I realized that my nights were no longer my own. They belonged to something else, something lurking in the dark, patiently waiting for me to make a move. The warehouse wasn't just a place of work, it was a prison, and I was starting to feel its cold embrace. The moon hung low and heavy in the night sky, illuminating the parking lot with a ghostly glow. I had always found comfort in the stillness of the night, but now, as I sat in the cramped security booth, my heart raced with a blend of anticipation and dread. It was my third night on the job at the old industrial complex on the outskirts of town, and each shift felt heavier with the weight of unspoken secrets. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting ominous shadows along the walls. I shifted in my chair, trying to shake off the creeping sensation that had settled over me since I first started. The complex had been abandoned for years, an hulking shell of rust and decay, yet it still housed a pulse, a sense of something lurking just outside the range of my sight. I adjusted the monitor's angle, scanning the dimly lit grounds for any signs of movement. The previous guards had warned me about unexplained noises, whispers echoing through the corridors, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone, shadows flitting out of the corner of their eyes. They'd made jokes about it, but there was a truth in their laughter. I considered myself sensible, a skeptic by nature, but the hairs on my arms stood on end as I recalled their stories. With every creak of the building, I felt the threads of their narratives wrapped tighter around me. My shift began at 10, and the minutes dragged as I monitored the silent security cameras. Midnight approached, and I poured myself another cup of coffee, letting the bitter liquid dull the edges of my anxiety. I had forgotten my phone in the car, which under normal circumstances wouldn't have bothered me, but tonight it felt like a mistake. The silence was oppressive, and the coffee struggled to keep me awake. I was growing restless, flicking through the camera feeds for the umpteenth time, when a flicker caught my eye on the northeastern perimeter. The screen showed nothing but darkness, but I leaned closer, squinting as if I could hold visibility into that void. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, but the feeling in my gut was insistent. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk. The beam cut through the shadows as I stepped outside the booth. The cold air clawed at my skin, the sound of gravel crunching beneath my boots echoing in the emptiness. I felt ridiculous, a lone figure confronting the night, but something compelled me onward. I approached the northeastern edge of the complex, keenly aware of every sound, the wind rustling through broken glass, the distant echo of my own breath. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a soft thud, as if something had shifted behind the wall of brambles that bordered the property. My heart threatened to burst from my chest. I pointed the flashlight toward the sound, praying it was just a raccoon or some other harmless creature. The beam illuminated nothing but the twisted branches and the remnants of a forgotten world. I exhaled slowly, my breath visible in the chill, and turned back toward the building. That was when I saw him. A shadowy figure stood against the far wall, partially obscured by the rusted remnants of a dilapidated structure. I froze, my instinct screaming to retreat, but curiosity anchored my feet to the ground. The figure appeared to be a man, but the way he stood, motionless, unnaturally still, sent a chill down my spine. "Hey!" I called out, trying to project confidence into my voice, but it came out as a strangled whisper. The figure didn't respond, he only shifted slightly, the dim light catching the contours of his face just enough for me to see a grimace etched in the shadows. "Who are you?" I asked again, taking a cautious step forward. There was an edge of desperation in my voice that I couldn't hide. The figure remained silent, as if he were a statue woven into the fabric of the night. Panic bubbled in my chest. I turned to run, but before I could take a step, he whispered, "Please, help me." The voice was raspy, strained, and unexpectedly fragile, sending a wave of conflicting emotions coursing through me. "What do you need?" I found myself asking against my better judgment, curiosity outweighing my fear. "Get me out," he replied, gesturing toward the darkness behind him. "They're coming." "Who?" I demanded, my breath quickening. Just as I was about to step closer, a sharp noise rippled through the air, a metallic clanging from somewhere within the building. The figure's expression shifted to one of terror, his eyes wide with panic. "Run," he shouted, breaking character, and in an instant, he vanished into the shadows behind him. I should have turned back. I should have retreated into the safety of the booth and locked the door tight. Instead, I let my feet carry me forward, driven by a mix of fear and an insatiable need to know what lay beyond that darkness. I stumbled over debris, the flashlight beam wobbling in my grasp, but I pressed on. As I rounded the corner of the building, I felt the world shift. The air grew thick, suffocating me as I ventured into the depths of the industrial complex. The clamor of metal rattled again, louder this time, like a warning bell chiming out of time. I stepped into a cavernous room where the light barely reached. The scent of rust and something acrid filled the air. I called out into the void, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice echoed back, a cruel reminder of my isolation. Then I saw him again, standing in the center of the room, his expression twisted in anguish. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice softer now, almost mournful. Behind him, shadows began to gather, coalescing into indistinct shapes that lurked on the edges of the light. A sudden realization flooded me. These were not the shadows of the night, they were something far worse. My instinct to flee surged within me, but a paralyzing fear gripped me. I had followed the darkness, but now it was too late to turn back. The chill of the night hung in the air like an unsettling omen, wrapping around me as I navigated the dimly lit corridors of the old hotel. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long, wavering shadows, making the walls appear to breathe. I had taken the late shift after a string of incidents, odd noises, an unsettling presence that some guests claimed they could sense. The management had dismissed the reports, but I knew better than to ignore the feeling that lingered just beyond the periphery of light. As the clock struck midnight, the world outside the hotel faded into an abyss of silence. I made my rounds, checking off the same unchanging list I had been assigned: the lobby, the dining area, the restrooms. Routine had settled over me like a heavy blanket, wrapping me in its false comfort. I grunted, trying to shake off the dread creeping up my spine. Security guards were supposed to be the stalwarts, the guardians of safety. Yet, in that moment, I felt more like a trespasser in a haunted house. The hotel was a relic of a bygone era, with its ornate decorations and creaky floorboards. Each step seemed to echo in the stillness, amplifying the sensation that someone or something was watching me. I paused in front of a large, dust-covered mirror at the end of the hall, catching sight of my reflection. I looked weary, my eyes bloodshot and sunken from too many nights like this one. I forced a smile, but the ghostly figure behind me betrayed my bravado. Spinning around, I found nothing but emptiness, the corridor stretching endlessly into darkness. I shook my head, dismissing the feeling of being observed as an overactive imagination fueled by fatigue. Back to work, I told myself, and I continued my patrol. The usual creaks of the building settled into a rhythm as I made my way toward the west wing. The air in that section of the hotel had always seemed heavier, almost oppressive. I had heard rumors that it was where the guests often reported the strangest occurrences: flickering lights, doors opening and closing on their own. I approached room 217, where an unsettling incident had taken place last week. A guest had claimed to see a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed, watching her sleep. I knocked lightly, receiving no response. The door was ajar, and I peered inside. The room was empty, the bed made, but I felt a chill brush past me, as if someone had just walked out. I stepped back, letting my instincts take over. Something was off. I swept the room, checking closet and bathroom, but it was devoid of life. Leaving the room, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. The unsettling whispers of the other guards echoed in my mind: just keep an eye on the West Wing after dark. I had dismissed them as mere ghost stories, but now they lingered like a serpent coiling in my gut. Continuing my patrol, I passed the main lobby, where the ancient chandelier hung like an ominous omen, ready to crash down. I felt a fleeting sense of safety in its light, but then it flickered violently, plunging the area into darkness. My heart raced, and I instinctively reached for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the void, trembling as I swept it around. "Hello?" I called out, the sound echoing back in mockery. Silence answered me, thick and loaded. But then I heard a low, throaty laugh, resonating from somewhere deep within the bowels of the hotel. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the sound, my mind racing through a catalog of possible explanations. I stepped cautiously toward the source, my flashlight beam quivering as I tried to project confidence. I found myself in front of the locked maintenance room, a place I had been instructed to stay clear of after hours. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back over my shoulder. The shadows danced behind me, but I couldn't turn back now. The laugh echoed again, undeniable and closer this time. With shaky hands, I gripped the doorknob, testing it. It was locked, just as expected. That laugh crawled under my skin and sent a jolt of urgency through me. I forced myself to move away, but my instinct screamed for me to stay vigilant. I didn't want to be alone. The thought of returning to the empty corridors made my skin crawl. I decided to check in with the front desk, hoping my colleague Jake would be there. The desk was vacant, the phone resting silently. Jake. I called, but only silence answered. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 1 a.m. Where could he be? I might as well check outside, I thought. Perhaps he had stepped out for a smoke. I grabbed my radio, hoping to find him. The air was cool as I stepped outside, the streetlights casting a soft glow on the pavement. My eyes darted around, searching the parking lot. Then I saw him, standing by the van, hands shoved deep in his pockets, his head tilted back to the sky. Jake. I called, relief washing over me. But as I approached, something felt wrong. His stance was too rigid, too still. Hey, what are you doing out here? I asked, but he didn't respond. As I got closer, my pulse quickened. Something was off about him, the way he stared into the nothingness above, as if something unseen had captivated him. I reached out, but before my fingers could brush his shoulder, he turned suddenly, his eyes wide and wild. The look in his gaze sent a wave of dread crashing down around me. Did you hear it? He whispered, his voice raspy. It's watching us. I glanced back at the hotel, the warm glow from the lobby disappearing as the lights flickered off one by one. The darkness swallowed the building, and with it, the last remnants of safety. As I stood there, paralyzed, a chilling laugh echoed once more, this time from the hotel itself. I turned back to Jake, but he was already walking away, a shadow moving against the deepening night, lost to the horror we both felt. Without thinking, I sprinted after him, the thrill of fear propelling me forward. The hotel loomed behind us, a dark figure in the night, as the laughter continued to haunt our steps. The night crept in like a thief, wrapping the building in a shroud of darkness that felt almost palpable. I had always prided myself on being a night owl, but being a security guard in a deserted office complex redefined what it meant to be awake when the world slept. The flickering fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across the expanse of the lobby, distorting the familiar into something sinister. My stomach churned with a kind of dread I couldn't quite place. I had just settled into my chair, its leather cracked and peeling, when the radio crackled to life. It was Rick, my partner, his voice a gravelly whisper. Hey, you're not gonna believe this. I just saw something on the monitors that creeped me out. I leaned closer to the radio, the static buzzing in my ear. What do you mean? What did you see? There was a pause on the other end, long enough for my heart to quicken. It's probably nothing. Just a shadow moving near the supply room on the 3rd floor. You know how those old cameras are. But it felt different. Like it was alive. Different how? I pressed, the unease spreading through me. Like it was watching me. I made a mental note to check the monitors later, but decided not to dwell on it. Instead, I forced a laugh, attempting to cut through the tension. Maybe it's just a raccoon got lost. You know how the janitorial staff leaves the back door unlocked. Rick chuckled weakly, though I could hear the uncertainty laced in his voice. Sure, let's go with that. The hours dragged on. Outside, the wind howled against the glass walls, the sound echoing through the empty halls. I flipped through the security logs, trying to distract myself from the discomfort that had settled like a weight in my chest. Nothing out of the ordinary had been recorded, but a slight chill in the air whispered of the supernatural. The flickering lights above me seemed to sync with the pounding of my heart. I glanced at my watch. It was nearing midnight. The ambient sounds of the building, distant hums, the clanking of metal from somewhere deep within grew louder, more insistent. I had thought the job would be dull, but now it felt like I was surrounded by something unseen, something that took a perverse pleasure in watching me. Rick, you still there? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Yeah, just checking the monitors. Still nothing out of the ordinary. Something in his voice, still tinged with unease, sent a shiver down my spine. I stood, the creaking of the chair breaking the tension, and decided to check the supply room he'd mentioned earlier. I grabbed a flashlight from the utility belt resting on my chair and headed toward the staircase. Each step echoed unnaturally, amplifying the silence of the building. I could feel the air growing heavier as I ascended, the familiar hallways morphing into a labyrinth of shadows. I reached the third floor, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The supply room was just a few doors down. The door to the supply room stood slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness beckoning me closer. I nudged it with my foot, and the door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit interior. Shelves lined with dusty boxes loomed like sentinels, their contents long forgotten. I took a deep breath, half expecting something to leap out at me. Hello? I called out, though I knew it was futile. The silence wrapped around me like a noose. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. As I scanned the shelves, the light flickered again, casting eerie shadows that danced around me. I moved deeper into the room, the urge to find something, anything, to reassure me growing stronger. I could still hear Rick's voice in my head, the unease lingering like an unwelcome guest. Suddenly, the flickering stopped. The lights above went out completely, plunging me into darkness. My breath quickened as I swung the flashlight around, the beam trembling. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, a primal instinct screaming for me to escape. Rick? I called out, my voice wavering. No reply. Just the oppressive silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, something moved. I turned, and for a millisecond, I thought I saw a figure, something tall and shadowy darting behind the shelves. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a loose box, sending it crashing to the ground. The sound reverberated through the emptiness, my own panic echoing in my ears. Rick! I shouted again, the desperation in my voice echoing against the walls. The flashlight flickered back on, illuminating the room just enough to see the chaos I had created. I could feel something watching me from the darkness, something that relished my fear. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I bolted for the door, nearly tripping over my own feet as I rushed back into the hallway. I glanced back, half expecting to see the figure, but nothing followed. Still, the feeling of being pursued clung to me like a shadow. I raced down the stairs, 3 steps at a time, crashing into the lobby where the faint glow of the security monitors provided a brief sense of safety. Rick sat there, his face pale, eyes wide in shock. Did you see it? He asked, the color draining from his skin. See what? I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. Something moved on the monitors, something wrong. His voice trembled. I turned to glance at the screens, half expecting to see the same shadow I thought I had seen. But the monitors displayed nothing but the same empty hallways, the same lifeless rooms. Yet deep down, I knew one thing. We were not alone. Story 6, Behind Bars, The Haunting Chronicles. When I first entered Westbridge Penitentiary, the raw stench of despair and sweat enveloped me like a suffocating fog. The building loomed before us, a colossal concrete behemoth surrounded by spirals of razor wire. Guards stood like sentinels at every corner, their faces obscured by shadows cast from the flickering fluorescent lights above. The clanging of heavy metal doors echoed in the distance, punctuated by the murmurs of inmates who shuffled about, their eyes darting with a mix of hope and dread. I had never planned to step foot inside a prison. I was a teacher, not a criminal, but a moment of reckless anger had led me here, a sentence I could hardly comprehend as I was shoved into the cold, impersonal intake room. I had spent my life advocating for children, not once considering that I might myself become a casualty of the system I had dedicated my career to improving. The officer processing my paperwork barely glanced up from his desk. "Name," he barked, his voice a gravelly growl. "David Sanders," I replied, my voice trembling. He continued typing, as if my name were just another entry in an endless list. I had hoped for an ounce of humanity, but the harsh fluorescent lighting only amplified the sterile atmosphere, isolating me further. I stared at my reflection in the glass. The scruffy beard and disheveled hair made me unrecognizable. This was not who I was. After an eternity of waiting, a guard gestured me forward. "This way," he said, leading me down a long corridor where the low hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above like a swarm of angry flies. The walls were painted a sickly green, covered in scuff marks and graffiti, emblematic of a place long forgotten by kindness. I felt the eyes of inmates on me, their stares heavy with judgment and curiosity, as if I were a fresh carcass among hungry vultures. My assigned cellmate was a man named Calvin. He was tall and wiry, with a grim smile that unnerved me. "Welcome to paradise," he joked, but the tremor in his voice belied the jest. I forced a chuckle but sensed the truth in his words. Paradise was not what I had imagined. It took less than a day to grasp the unspoken rules of survival within these walls. Trust was a luxury, fear was the currency. Calvin seemed harmless enough, initially. We shared stories about our pasts. His was filled with tales of petty thefts gone wrong, while mine felt like a confession I was reluctant to share. I avoided the details of the incident that had sent me spiraling into this abyss. I clung to the hope that if I kept my past buried, perhaps it would stay there. As the days turned into weeks, I found a rhythm amid the chaos. I learned how to navigate the yard, where inmates gathered in tightly knit groups, their conversations laced with coded languages and veiled threats. I witnessed fights break out over nothing, a misplaced glance or an accidental bump. The guards, indifferent to the scuffles, often turned a blind eye, favoring their authority over any semblance of justice. There was one man, a hulking figure named Griffin, who made my skin crawl. He was a predator, and I could smell his malice from a distance. The way he stalked the yard with a predatory gait, eyes glinting with sadistic pleasure, made my pulse quicken. I avoided him at all costs, staying close to Calvin, who occasionally shot me an understanding look as I recounted my day's miseries. But the real terror began late one night. I lay on my thin mattress, the sounds of a distant argument drifting in from the corridor. It was a familiar sound, heated words escalating into shouts, but this time something felt different. The quiet of the cell was overshadowed by a sudden commotion outside, followed by the unmistakable thud of a body hitting the ground. Calvin sat up abruptly, eyes wide. "Something's going down," he whispered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his usually composed demeanor. I strained to listen. The cacophony of shouting intensified, accompanied by the slamming of doors. Then, a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight settled upon us. It was a silence that sent a chill down my spine. I could feel Calvin's breath quickening beside me. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Without answering, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood. "We need to check." Before I could protest, he slipped out of our cell, the metal door creaking ominously as it opened. A rush of cool air swept in, and I hesitated for just a moment, caught between fear and curiosity. I followed him into the dimly lit corridor, feeling the shadows stretch and twist around us. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting a ghostly glow that distorted our surroundings. "Stay close," Calvin warned, his voice now low and urgent. We crept down the hall, our footsteps muffled by the cold concrete. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath. As we approached the common area, I could see figures moving in the darkness, their silhouettes shifting chaotically. Then, out of the shadows, a scream pierced through the stillness. I froze, the sound reverberating in my chest like a warning bell. It was a guttural, primal sound that resonated with the deepest corners of my mind, awakening something ancient and fearful. And then I saw him, Griffin, standing tall among the chaos, a twisted smile on his face as he loomed over a crumpled body sprawled on the floor. In that moment, I realized the horror of this place was not confined to the walls of the prison. It seeped into its very soul, feeding on fear and despair, and I had unwittingly become a part of it. As my heart raced, I knew there was no turning back. The prison was alive with malignancy, and I was merely a pawn in its twisted game. The clang of the door behind me reverberated through the hollow corridors of Hawthorne Correctional Facility, shredding the fragile thread of hope that had begun to weave itself in my mind. I had been inside the prison for a little over a week, and already I could feel the weight of despair settling over me like a thick fog, obscuring anything resembling freedom. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast eerie shadows on the peeling walls, and I shivered as I passed the cells, each one a tomb for the souls trapped within. I had heard stories from the other inmates about the facility. There were rumors of the warden's cruelty, whispers of inmates who had vanished without a trace, and tales of secret punishments that unfolded behind the locked doors of solitary confinement. As I made my way to the mess hall, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of the guards lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the oppressive silence that enveloped the place. The mess hall was a cacophony of clattering trays and harsh voices. I picked up my meal, a gray lump of something that might have once been meat, and took a seat at an empty table. I tried to blend in, to avoid drawing attention to myself, but it was impossible. The other inmates eyed me warily, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain. I was new, and that alone made me a target. "Hey, pretty boy," a voice drawled from across the table. I looked up to see a man with a heavily tattooed face and a scar slicing through his brow. "You lost?" I forced a smile, but it felt like a grimace. "No, I just what? Just think you can stroll in here and not pay the toll?" His friends laughed, a chorus of cheering that rang in my ears. I looked around, searching for an escape, but the eyes of the other inmates bore down on me like a lead weight. I had to stand my ground. "I'm not looking for trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The tattooed man leaned forward, his expression shifting from mockery to something more dangerous. "You're already in trouble, sweetheart. Just wait till nightfall. You'll see how much trouble you really are in." Unease crawled along my spine, and I felt the walls of the mess hall closing in around me. I pushed my tray away, suddenly uninterested in the rancid food. I was desperate to get back to my cell, to the small comfort of solitude, away from this oppressive atmosphere. As I left the mess hall, I could feel their eyes on my back, their laughter echoing in my ears. I hurried along the corridor, the fluorescent lights flickering ominously above me. The memory of the tattooed man's words clung to me like a shroud. Nightfall. What could possibly happen at nightfall that could heighten the terror of this place? That evening, as the sun dipped below the distant hills, I sat on my narrow bunk, the dim light of my cell barely illuminating the grimy walls. I tried to distract myself by reviewing my sentence, my reasons for being here, but my mind was a constant whirl of fear. I was a nobody in a sea of hardened criminals, and I had no idea how to navigate the treacherous waters of prison life. The lights flickered again, and I could hear the distant sounds of the prison settling into an uneasy quiet. It was the kind of silence that made my skin prickle, the kind that promised something was lurking just beyond my perception. I lay back, pulling the thin blanket over me, but sleep wouldn't come. I felt as if the walls were closing in on me, and every creak and groan of the prison became a sinister whisper. Hours passed, the dark stretching endlessly like a sinister void. Then came the sound of metal scraping against metal, sharp and jarring. I sat up, straining to listen. The noise was faint, but it filled the air with a sense of foreboding. My heart raced as I swung my legs out of bed, the cold linoleum biting at my bare feet. I crept to the bars of my cell, peering into the darkness of the corridor. Shadows flitted past, indistinct shapes moving with a purpose I couldn't discern. I could hear muffled voices, rough and urgent, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. My heart pounded as I pressed my face against the cold metal. "Why is he still here?" a voice hissed, low and gravelly. "He should be gone. Just wait. Patience is key. They'll come for him soon." The words sent a chill down my spine. They were talking about me, and what they planned to do with me sent my imagination spiraling into the abyss. I stepped back, my mind racing. I had to know more. I had to understand the threat I was facing. I waited, heart pounding in my ears, until the whispers faded into the distance. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I needed to find answers. Gathering my courage, I stepped out of my cell and into the corridor. The air was thick with tension and a palpable sense of danger. The darkness enveloped me, and I crept further down the hall, drawn by the instinct to uncover the truth. I didn't know where I was heading, but as the silence deepened, I felt the weight of the prison bearing down on me, a dark force lurking in the corners, watching, waiting. I couldn't turn back now. I was already caught in the snare of Hawthorne Correctional, and whatever lay ahead was inevitable. The shadows danced around me, casting long, flickering shapes that whispered of secrets long buried. My every step echoed with the knowledge that in this place, there were no innocent bystanders. In the prison's depths, I would learn that survival meant navigating a world where horror was the only constant. When I first stepped into the prison, the heavy air felt thick with despair and regret. They had told me stories of the men who had walked its corridors, marred by the choices they made, haunted by the demons of their pasts. I had thought I wanted to understand them, to capture their stories for the world outside. But now, as I sat in the dimly lit visitor room, I began to wonder if I had been naive. The concrete walls seemed to close in on me, making the fluorescent lights buzz ominously, casting a sickly glow. I fidgeted with my pen and notepad, my heart racing. Each tick of the clock echoed against the silence, a reminder of the time I had squandered trying to uncover the truth. There was something about this place, a palpable weight of anguish, that pressed down on me, rendering me almost breathless. My interviewee, a man named Eli, arrived in shackles, his hands bound before him. He had been one of the most notorious inmates, rumored to have been involved in a series of gruesome crimes. He was a paradox, a soft-spoken man whose eyes betrayed a haunting intelligence. The staff had warned me to be cautious, but I had to confront the fear that crept into my bones. Eli sat across from me, the table between us separating our worlds. He glanced at me with a mixture of curiosity and something darker, something lurking just beneath the surface. "You really want to know what it's like in here?" His voice was gravelly, each word a stone dropped into still waters. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "I want to understand." I was met with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Understanding has a price, you know." He began to recount stories of prison life, of violent shakedowns, and the constant fear of betrayal. But as he spoke, the atmosphere shifted. His tales grew darker, filled with whispers of an unseen terror that roamed the halls, an entity that claimed the souls of those who lost hope. I tried to maintain my composure, but each word he spoke tightened the grip of dread around my heart. The first time Eli mentioned it, I thought it was just another of his elaborate stories. "The warden keeps it locked up," he said, lowering his voice. "But every few years, someone disappears." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "They say it's a thing that feeds on fear." I laughed nervously. "You're not serious, are you?" His eyes narrowed, and I felt the temperature in the room drop. "You think this place is normal? There's a reason the guards look over their shoulders." He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You hear the whispers at night. You hear them calling." I wanted to dismiss him, to remind myself that he was just a man prone to hyperbole. But there was something in his gaze, a flicker of genuine fear that made me uneasy. The air around us thickened as he continued, detailing the shadows that danced along the walls in the dead of night, the chilling laughter that echoed through the cell blocks when no one was there. "And the disappearances," Eli said, a tremor in his voice. "It's always the same. One moment they're here, and the next, gone. The guards don't talk about it, but the inmates know. It's a warning we've all heard, but few survive to tell the tale." I shivered at his words, overwhelmed by the oppressive atmosphere of the room. "Have you ever seen it?" I asked, my curiosity mingling with fear. He hesitated, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in. "Not personally," he confessed, "but I've heard it. The whispers get louder when it's close." He looked back at me, his expression grave. "You'll know when it's coming. Trust me." I could see the weight of his words hanging in the air. The dread is palpable, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I forced myself to stay calm, to maintain my composure. "And what happens to those who disappear?" He shrugged, a haunting smile ghosting across his lips. "It's said they become part of it. You never really escape." I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I glanced at the guards, who were watching us intently, their expressions unreadable. Eli leaned back in his chair, seemingly amused by my growing unease. "You wanted the truth, didn't you?" As our time came to an end, I gathered my things, feeling the weight of his stories pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just been sitting across from a man. I had encountered something much darker, an echo of the souls lost within these walls. When I stepped outside, the sun felt like a cold, distant memory. I walked to my car with a sense of urgency, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see shadows lurking. As I drove away from the prison, a creeping doubt settled in my mind. Had I truly escaped, or had I merely stepped beyond a threshold that would lead me back to the very darkness I sought to understand? The road twisted and turned as I navigated my way home, but it felt like the confines of the prison were still wrapped around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers would follow long after I left, waiting patiently for the moment I might return. The stories Eli shared reverberated in my mind, a chilling reminder that there were horrors in this world that went beyond comprehension, horrors that thrived on fear and fed on despair. And as I pulled into my driveway, heart pounding, I knew this was just the beginning. The dampness of the cell clung to my skin like a second layer, and every breath I took seemed to swirl in the heavy air, thick with despair and the sour stench of humanity. It had been 3 weeks since I first arrived at Blackwell Penitentiary, and every tick of the clock felt like an eternity. I had learned the prison's rhythms, the echoes of guards' boots on concrete, the clinking of metal bars, the distant wails of men broken by years behind these walls. My cellmate, Frank, had a penchant for stories, though I struggled to tell whether they were meant to amuse or to terrify. One night, as we lay on our threadbare cots, He whispered about the wailing man, an inmate who had supposedly gone mad and roamed the halls at night, his cries echoing through the corridors. He lost his mind, Frank had said, his voice low and conspiratorial. They say he saw something he shouldn't have. You can hear him if you listen closely. The way he spoke made my skin crawl, and I found myself staring into the darkness, feeling every shadow twist and stretch. I didn't want to believe him, yet a part of me was drawn into the web of fear he spun. I had come to this place for a crime I regretted deeply, but the weight of guilt was nothing compared to the weight of this place's malevolence. Each morning, I gazed at the barred window, the gray sky a reminder of my imprisonment. The sunlight had grown weaker as the days passed, swallowed by thick clouds that hummed ominously overhead, as if even the weather mourned for those confined within. On the 13th day, something changed. As the sun dipped behind the clouds, I sat on my cot, tracing the cracked walls with my fingertips. It was then that I heard it, the faintest of whispers, a broken voice drifting through the cracks of the cell. I turned to Frank, who had fallen silent. He looked at me, his eyes wide, and nodded slowly. The sound was unmistakable. It was a wailing, a mournful cry that sent chills racing down my spine. Every night after that, the wailing man's cries pierced the silence like an unwelcome specter. I lay awake, heart thumping in my chest, waiting for the next outburst. I was no longer alone in my cell. Paranoia crept in like a thief, stealing my sleep and leaving me vulnerable. Frank's stories became my reality. He spoke of the corrections officers, those who turned a blind eye, and the shadows that loomed just beyond the reach of the flickering fluorescent lights. "Stay close," Frank warned me one evening. "You don't want to get caught alone." My fear of the wailing man morphed into a palpable anxiety. I began to notice the other inmates acting strange, their eyes darting as if they sensed an invisible danger lurking in the corners. One man in particular, a towering figure known as Maze, seemed to take a keen interest in me. His gaze felt like a weight pressing down on my shoulders, and I tried my best to avoid his path, fearing that he might see the vulnerability in my eyes. On the evening of the 15th day, a sudden cell block lockdown turned the atmosphere into a cauldron of tension. Guards shouted commands as we were shoved into our cells. I pressed my ear against the cool metal of the bars, listening to the chaos outside. Heavy footsteps stomped down the hall, and I could hear the muffled voices of officers echoing intense conversation. "Wailing man's loose," one of the guards barked. "Search the whole block. No one gets out until we find him." A flood of dread washed over me. The wailing man, he was real, and there he was, somewhere in the prison, roaming free while we were all trapped in our cells. I could feel the fear radiating from the inmates, a palpable energy that crackled in the air as whispers of his haunting spread. My heart raced as I recalled Frank's stories. It was said that once the wailing man caught your eye, you would never see the light of day again. I clamped my jaw tight, desperately trying to drown out the sound of the approaching footsteps. I shifted my gaze to Frank, whose face had turned an ashen shade. "He can't get inside here," he assured me, though there was an edge of doubt in his voice. I glanced at the window, shadows flickering as the last remnants of daylight faded. The guards were still searching, their shouts growing closer. I felt trapped, claustrophobic. I turned to the door, still locked, the meager light from the corridor casting a distorted shadow of the bars onto the ground. It was then that I heard it, the chilling, mournful wail echoing from the depths of the prison. The sound seemed to wrap around me, compelling and terrifying in equal measure. My breath caught in my throat. The cries grew louder, closer. The very walls felt alive, vibrating with his sorrow. "There's something wrong," Frank muttered, his face pale with fear. "We need to get out. Now!" Panic surged through me. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I had to trust my instincts. But how? The wailing man was out there, and I had no idea what horrors awaited us in the shadows. The cries intensified, twisting into something almost human yet utterly foreign, a siren song luring me closer to the unknown. The guards shouted, their radios crackling with urgency, and suddenly the door to our cell swung open, flooding the room with harsh light. I squinted against the glare, heart pounding as several guards rushed in, their eyes wide with horror. "Stay back," one of them barked, but my instincts took over. I pushed past them, propelled by desperation, sprinting down the corridor, the echo of the wailing man's cries driving me forward. I had to escape whatever nightmare was drawing ever closer, even if it meant plunging into the darkness of the prison. When I awoke, the cold touch of reality hit me like a frigid wave. The dim light filtering through the barred window cast elongated shadows that danced on the cement walls. I lay on the stained mattress, my heart racing, remnants of the nightmare still clinging to the edges of my mind. I tried to shake off the dread, but the memory of the last few days was an anchor dragging me into a spiraling abyss. Life inside the prison was a grotesque rhythm. I could hear the distant clang of metal doors and the ominous echoes of boots on concrete. There was a constant, heavy tension that filled the air, an unspoken agreement among the inmates to avoid stepping on each other's toes. I picked up my cot's thin pillow and pressed it against my chest, trying to convince myself I was still human, that I had not become just another ghost in this hellish place. It had been a week since I first met Samuel, and by now, I understood the unyielding weight of his warnings. There were whispers circulating about the man in cell 27. They said he was cursed, that he had once held the power to ensnare souls, drawing them into a never-ending cycle of despair. Samuel claimed he had witnessed it himself, how inmates disappeared after hearing the man's voice, how their sanity unraveled like a frayed rope. I rolled onto my side, staring at the wall. The peeling paint resembled the flesh of someone long gone, the colors shifting, swirling into grotesque shapes. I could almost swear I heard faint murmurs rising from the depths of the cell block. It was as if the walls were alive, whispering secrets that threatened to consume anyone who dared to listen. "Hey, you awake?" A voice broke through my thoughts. I turned to see Marcus, a fellow inmate with sunken cheeks and weary eyes. He stood at the edge of my cot, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Yeah," I replied, forcing my voice to break the silence. "What's up?" "I heard something last night." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. It came from 27. My stomach twisted. "What did you hear?" "Crying. Or maybe laughter." "Hard to tell," he said, his gaze darting toward the barred window as if the shadows were listening. But then, it went silent. Like he knew we were listening. I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat. "You should stay away from there." Marcus hesitated, then said, "I don't know, man. Something about that cell, it pulls you in. It's like a magnet." I wanted to argue, to warn him that curiosity was a dangerous game here, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere, deep down, I felt the pull too. The day dragged on, each hour a monotonous drone of routine. Yet, as darkness fell and the prison settled into an eerie quiet, I couldn't shake off the growing sense of dread. I lay on my cot, staring at the cracks in the wall, my mind racing. What if Samuel was right? What if the man in cell 27 wasn't just a tale spun to frighten newcomers, but a real embodiment of nightmares? Around midnight, I heard it, a faint, almost melodic voice echoing through the halls. It resonated like a siren song, weaving through the concrete and steel, drawing me to the source. I knew I should resist, but something primal within me urged me to listen. I swung my legs over the edge of the cot, the metal frame creaking beneath my weight. Cautiously, I stepped into the darkness. The corridor was dimly lit, but I followed the voice, each step sending shivers down my spine. Shadows danced along the walls, taunting me, reminding me of the horrors that lurked just out of sight. I paused outside cell 27, the cold air wrapping around me like a vice. The singing stopped abruptly. A heavy silence settled, leaving an unsettling tension in its wake. I strained my ears, sensing something or someone inside. "What do you want?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open, a slight push revealing a sliver of darkness. I could see nothing but the faint outline of a figure. "Come closer," the voice beckoned, smooth and inviting, yet laced with an undertone of malice. I hesitated, fear clawing at my insides. "Who are you?" "Only a friend," the figure replied, his voice dripping with honeyed malice. "I know your fears, your desires. I can give you everything you've ever wanted." The words lingered in the air, enticing yet dangerous. I wanted to turn back, to escape this maddening pull, but my feet remained rooted to the ground. "Leave me alone," I shouted, suddenly feeling a surge of defiance. The figure laughed softly, the sound echoing like a tolling bell. "You cannot escape me. I am in your mind, your heart. You cannot fathom the depths of my power." With that, a cold wind swept through the corridor, extinguishing the feeble light and plunging the space into darkness. Panic surged within me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum of impending doom. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence that enveloped me. I turned and sprinted back to my cell, desperation fueling my every move. As I slammed the door shut, I pressed my back against it, panting heavily. The echoes of his voice still lingered in my mind, a reminder that I was not alone in this prison. I lay back down, trembling as I tried to calm my racing heart. I knew one thing for certain: I could not ignore the man in cell 27. The darkness was closing in, and I was caught in its web, inching ever closer to the edge of sanity.